Welcome to Human Monsters. This episode was adapted from the memoir Broken, the most shocking childhood story ever told, an inspirational author who survived it, by Keenan. Shy is the second child of Jennifer and only child of Frederick Wooten, born Karen, and she was born in 1963. Jennifer and Frederick were financially unstable and did a lot of couch surfing during Shy's early years. They stayed with family, friends, or whoever was generous enough to let them stay. Eventually, this became tiresome for all who hosted them, and they settled in an apartment beneath that of Shy's Aunt Violet. Jennifer and Frederick were habitual offenders of petty crime, mostly theft. They would leave Shy alone at home, even when she was an infant, while they went out stealing and spending the proceeds of stealing. Not only did they neglect their care of baby Karen, but they seldom attended to their housekeeping duties, and soon the house grew foul with clutter and filth. It attracted pests like cockroaches. It acquired an odor that was so pungent it brought water to the eyes. They would leave the radio on when they went out. The electricity generator was coin-operated, and after a few hours of radio play, the apartment would be plunged into darkness. When her parents returned, they were usually drunk and or high. It was the swinging 60s, and they were swinging like a motherfucker. They parented at their convenience, much to the inconvenience of their child. They must not have been aware that baby Karen had a painful skin condition with a tapestry of red bleeding sores covering 60% of her body. She was underweight and frequently distressed by her lot in life, without even knowing it was amoral. She was left to fend for herself on a urine-soaked cot, with the cockroaches that crawled over her body as her only companions. The diapers went unchanged for 24 hours at a time. She starved for hours once the bottles were sucked dry. Jennifer and Fred wouldn't allow visitors in their apartment, so nobody knew how grossly inappropriate it was for child rearing. One night, their neighbor and relative Violet heard baby Karen's weeping after the radio grew quiet. She broke into the apartment and discovered, to her horror, the appalling conditions in which Karen had been living. Violet and other relatives intervened. Karen, Jennifer, and Frederick were plucked out of the apartment. Karen was seen by a doctor for the first time since she was born. Her skin condition was treated and cured. A couple known as the Wallbridges monitored the situation and even took care of Karen in their own home from time to time. During one such visit, Jennifer and Frederick planned and executed the robbery of a gas station. It didn't go as planned, and Jennifer was nearly charged and convicted. She had sex with the arresting officer and avoided prosecution due to his corruption. He got her pregnant, and she manipulated, or shall we say, blackmailed him into giving her money. Otherwise, she would have reported their encounter. This was how Karen's sister Denise was born. Jennifer decided to turf Frederick out of her life. What she wanted most now was social housing, or what is referred to in England as council housing. She appealed to the Wallbridges to help her with it. She claimed to have found Jesus, or at least she appeared sincere enough for them to fall for it. As a result, they endorsed her application for council housing. The application was approved. They were living in the best council housing tax dollars could afford. Frederick was working, Jennifer was stealing. The neglect of their children continued as before. During one of her parents' fights, Jennifer told Frederick she didn't love him, and soon after he was kicked out. While he was leaving, Frederick accidentally set fire to the house. When the firemen arrived, one child was missing from the house. Karen was found in a locked wardrobe. She was frightened, but otherwise unscathed. The house was mostly just smoke damaged. Now that Fred was gone, Jennifer's source of income was government benefits and the proceeds of crime. All she wanted out of life was a house like the one she was living in. The children were just a burden she wanted to offload. Once again, she went to the Wallbridges with her hand out. She told them she was poor, abandoned by Fred, and overwhelmed by the demands of childcare. They weren't quite so sympathetic this time around. They told her to stick it out and find a way to cope. Jennifer was enraged by what she considered to be betrayal on their part, and she never forgave them. Soon, she and her children were bouncing from apartment to house, showing up at mealtime at the homes of relatives and friends. They ate others' food, and she let her children run wild in their domiciles. She was a professional parasite. A pivotal moment in Karen's childhood came when Jennifer met Stanley Claridge. He had been a foster child and was considered strange even as a child. He was adopted by an uncle and aunt at the age of 10 because nobody else wanted him. It was a pity-based adoption. He said his siblings hated him, though that was true of pretty much everybody with whom he came in contact. He had no friends and claimed to have been sexually abused in his home, though he says he enjoyed these encounters because he was at least receiving attention. He said that a male adult perpetrated the abuse and that sometimes they would abuse other children as a duo. He never admitted to both things at the same time. He said he was shy in the company of women and was far more comfortable in the presence of much younger boys. Others interpreted it simply as homosexuality, much to his relief, though it was a misinterpretation since he was really a pedophile. Back then, homosexuality and pedophilia were viewed by the government as equally perverted and immoral. Nevertheless, Stanley found the status of homosexual far more appealing than that of pedophile. Stanley's adoptive mother was concerned about his sexual behavior, so she had him enlist in the army to make a man out of him. He worked as a cook's assistant and bottle washer during his time in the service. The patriarchal environment of military culture was not enough to purge Stanley of his appetite for young male flesh, and he frequently brought home young men when he was on leave. His adoptive mother, Nancy, forced Stanley into a loveless heterosexual marriage. He had 2 children with his wife. He and his wife were soon divorced. He was a physically abusive alcoholic and somehow was awarded full custody of his 2 children after the mother abandoned them all. One of them eventually went to live in another country, but his daughter Roma lived with Stanley. In 1965, Stanley was a laborer and lived in a 3-bedroom row house. Stanley was prone to dishonesty and exaggeration, especially when it came to his financial and social status. It was this tendency to sell himself as more worthy as a mate than he was that attracted Jennifer. She had no use for anybody she couldn't use, and he claimed to have much that she could squeeze out of him. To their surprise, Jennifer and Stanley were already part of a network. Jennifer's brother Ken was married to Pat Claridge, who was Stanley's cousin and the daughter of their grandparents. Jennifer met Stanley at a family gathering, and she believed every word he told her, every lie he told her, didn't question a single word. Jennifer became determined to get her hooks into Stanley by any means necessary. She was 20 years old, and her children were under 4. Stanley was 37 years old. Jennifer heard about Stanley's quirks, but she was blinded by the pound signs in her eyes. She was also focused on the cleaning lady and the nanny he promised her. The nanny would be his daughter, Roma. Stanley was still unsure of himself around women, and Jennifer decided she would unleash the power of her feminine allure to seduce him into taking her on as his companion. She observed that the less interest she showed, the more determined he became to engage with her. Stanley was more excited to meet her little girls. Excited is actually semantically inadequate to describe how thrilled he was. He was over the fucking moon. Before he met them, he wouldn't stop pestering her about meeting them. He wanted to know when it would be. He was like a child in the backseat of a car asking, "Are we there yet?" A child's excitement first thing Christmas morning didn't compare. Unlike many step-parents who dread the potential drama that emerges in the home environment of a blended family, Stanley couldn't wait to do all he could for the girls. He wanted to cook for them, bathe them, put them to bed. He hadn't even met them, and already he wanted to play the role of surrogate father. Did I mention that he wanted to bathe them? Roma was not nearly as pleased as her father about her new family arrangement. Stanley didn't tolerate her objections and would send her to her mother's home if she voiced her opposition. He also made her into the household's unpaid slave. Jennifer sure was disappointed by Stanley's home. It wasn't much better than where she and the girls had been living. His job wasn't much more impressive either. He was a manual laborer, blue collar. People dreamed of the life he promised her, and she found out, much to her dismay, that it hadn't escalated beyond the dream stage for him either. Despite her disappointment, she packed herself and the girls up, and they moved to London, where they began to live with Stanley. He was so keen on caring for the girls, and Jennifer was freed up to do as she pleased once she was relieved of those duties. So now Karen's fate was sealed. Shai recalls her first encounter with Stanley, who she often referred to as Shiny Head because he was bald. The first time we all went to visit Shiny Head at his home stands out clearly in my mind. I remember we were all in his living room when he picked me up and sat me on his lap. As I was sitting on his lap, his hands slipped up my dress, and I remember a sharp, searing pain in my bottom. I yelped and squirmed, trying to get off his lap, but the dark-haired lady looked angry and told me to be nice to my new daddy. I knew I didn't want the dark-haired lady to be angry, so I sat still. Shiny Head seemed nice and friendly, although I didn't like how his scratchy face hurt mine, or how hard he held me on his lap, and how sitting there made my bum sore. I didn't really know him, but I knew enough to do as I was told, so that's what I did. Soon after these initial impressions, little Karen, her mother, and sister moved into Stanley's house. Aside from Stanley and his daughter, another man would occupy the house, a man she found to be rather malevolent. Shai recalled another unsettling situation from these early days. Just a few weeks after we'd moved in with Shiny Head, when I was 3 or 4, I remember being in a darkened room and lying naked on a table that seemed a long way from the ground. A harsh, bright light kept flashing in my eyes, making them sting and water. I was aware of faces in the room, but I didn't know who they belonged to. A strange clicking sound always followed the flashing light, and I remember feeling cold and worried. Then I saw Shiny Head and the new dark-haired face walking round the table, looking down at me. Suddenly, flashing white and blue lights exploded in my head, followed by the most excruciating, searing pain coming from my lower body. I felt winded and couldn't breathe. I started to scream as the pain shot through me. My eyes were shut tight, and I sobbed when I could breathe enough to do so. I opened my eyes to see what the faces were doing, and saw through my tears that Shiny Head was directly above me, moving up and down. I realized that Shiny Head down meant less pain, so I tried to move away from the Shiny Head up movement. It was then that I realized that I was unable to move my arms. I didn't know why or how. I just knew I couldn't move them at all. My legs, too, were being squashed by Shiny Head, and I felt unable to fight or move, so I stopped trying. When the movement eventually stopped and I caught my breath, I screamed. Shiny Head punched me hard across the side of my head. He did it again and again. I saw the bright lights in my head every time Shiny Head hit me on it, and I started to understand that the flashing lights in my head meant that pain was never far behind. I was too shocked to make another sound. I was trying to catch my breath when the movement very quickly started again. Only now it was the dark-haired face. The pain was the same. It burned its way through my lower body. But this time I felt like I needed to poo. I couldn't feel my legs anymore and was sure that I was pooing. I could smell it, and I could feel it. I tried to look down to see, but the dark-haired face kept trying to put his mouth over mine, which was making it even harder to breathe. I tried to stay still and quiet and waited for it to stop. The next thing I knew, I was in the kitchen in the tin bath. Shiny Head and the dark-haired face were standing near to me. They looked very tall. My bottom felt raw. I was cold, and my body was juddering with shock. Sitting naked in the bath, with the top of my body above the water, I felt so vulnerable, and all I could think was that I didn't want to be naked in front of them ever again. The bath water was tepid and making me colder, but it felt like a cover, so I sank down into it, shivering and whimpering. Shiny Head rubbed what felt like liquid fire all over me, inside and outside of my very sore body. I started to cry, but Shiny Head just said, "You need to make sure you're clean all over." I couldn't have known it then, but this was the first of many of Shiny Head's infamous and much feared tin baths. When it was finally finished and I was dressed again, I went up to my room and curled into a tight ball on my bed and quietly sobbed to myself. For ages after, I walked around like a zombie, dazed and distressed. I was suddenly snapped out of it when I found my little sister, Denise, naked and sobbing uncontrollably in the loft. Her blonde hair was sticking to her face, which was wet with tears. She was unable to speak, but she didn't need to, because I knew instinctively that what had happened to me had happened to her. I don't know what I thought other than that I understood, so I hugged her and dressed her and sat with her till she was calmer. I felt angry. I didn't want anyone to hurt her, and I just wanted to make her feel better. So I started pulling faces and pretending to fall asleep, leaning on my bended elbow, slipping off and falling face down onto the mattress. She suddenly stopped crying and started to quietly giggle. The more she giggled, the harder I tried to make her. It made us both feel better. It always did. The preceding scenario happened frequently in Shai's childhood. Not only does she remember being raped by Stanley and his accomplice, but she remembers being savagely beaten in the nude in the loft. He whipped her with his belt on the backside and legs. It happened all over the house, but he was most fond of beating her in the loft. If she resisted going to the loft, the beatings would only be prolonged and escalate in aggression and brutality. He had a vindictive streak in him. He would tell her that if she resisted being beaten about the buttocks, he would be forced to attack the rest of her body. Either way, torture was guaranteed in the house of Claridge. The house's appearance was dingy and aesthetically bereft. Its domestic culture was morally squalid, sleazy, and unsavory. She once walked in on Stanley as his dark-haired lackey performed fellatio on him. The dark-haired beast shot her the evil eye. If he had been a Star Wars character, the irises of his eyes would have been yellow. Pure, concentrated, unmitigated evil was embodied in both men, and there they were, exchanging bodily fluids as if feeding on each other's life forces. Unfortunately, the stink eye didn't represent the be-all and end-all of abuse the dark-haired one had in store for Karen. As Shai recalls, the dark-haired face caught me alone and took me to play at the bottom of the garden. He took me into the shed and closed the door. Suddenly he pushed me against the shed wall and roughly grabbed my hands above my head, lifting me so that my feet couldn't feel the floor. Then he used his pee thing to make the pain in my bottom and stomach start all over again. The blue and white flashing lights returned. He seemed angry at me for seeing him with shiny head and started calling me names like dirty girl and little tart. After that, he took me to the shed a lot, and every time he did, he made me feel like I wanted to poo. One time I pooed on him by accident, and he punched me in my bottom till I screamed out for Mum. She didn't come. She was often out, or maybe she just couldn't hear me, but he stopped when I wouldn't stop screaming and let me run into the house. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I didn't even have a name for it besides horrible and pain. I just knew I wanted it to stop. Jennifer was more than happy to upload the responsibility for the care of her children to Stanley and his Sith apprentice. As Shai put it, my mother had always been an absent parent, but when we moved into Shinyhead's house, her appearances became less and less frequent. I soon realized that it was pointless to call out for my mother when the faces hurt me. It achieved nothing. No matter how hard I cried or screamed, she never once came. So, Stanley and his toady raped and beat little Karen. Her stepsister Roma didn't do any of the same, but she did verbally abuse her, calling her things like smelly and stupid. She told Karen that nobody loved her, especially not her. Karen and Roma had never even been formally introduced. Roma was an animated part of the scenery, and, from a psychological standpoint, an eyesore. She was convinced that Karen and Denise were there to steal her father. If only they had told her they never wanted him in the first place. Speaking of Roma, she found other ways to make Karen and Denise miserable. She was forced to do all the cooking, and her culinary efforts kept the antacid industry in business. She was forced to babysit the girls constantly, beginning at the age of 10, when they moved in. If she ever complained, Jennifer would beat her viciously and then order a hit on her when Stanley got home. Roma had been her father's little princess until Karen and Denise moved in. Karen didn't like being Stanley's favorite because that meant being raped, but it wasn't something she could address when she spoke to Roma. The abuse became more frequent and incremental in its injuriousness. To quote Shy, "By the time I was 5 in 1968, there seemed to be more and more faces making the pain and the horrible happen. There was a new dark-haired face, hairy face, stinky face, angry face, red face, pain face, big head face, and spitty face. Some would have the machine that made the strange clicking sound when the light flashed. I was sure I once heard Shinyhead call it a paranoid camera. They would never let me see what the paranoid camera did, but I never liked it, because it made my eyes sting. Sometimes I would see red stuff running between my legs or coming from my nose when I touched it. It made me scared. I didn't know what it was. Eventually, I came to understand that the red stuff was blood. And all I knew about blood was that it was meant to stay on the inside, or you die. I hated what the faces were doing to me. It hurt so much. I couldn't physically stop them. I tried struggling. I tried screaming. I tried to run away, but nothing I knew of worked. Once I'd tried all that, I would just close my eyes and cry. But even that didn't help. It just made some of the faces angrier. Some would just smack me silent. Others would tell me to stop crying, open my eyes, and look at the paranoid camera, yelling at me for spoiling their pictures. Others would want me to look at them, but I didn't want to see their faces or what they were doing. So I learnt to keep my eyes wide open and not cry, but blur them out. I learnt to stay as still as I could and just pray for it to be over soon. After a while, though, even staying still and quiet with my eyes open didn't help. I realized it just made some of the faces think that I liked or wanted what they were doing. And then it seemed like it went on forever. Saying no, complaining, holding my breath, fake sleeping or unconsciousness also seemed to make them think I liked or wanted it more. It was so confusing. They would constantly be telling me that I liked what they were doing and that I wanted it when I was absolutely sure that I didn't. I remember sitting in my room thinking, why do they keep asking me if I like it, when I tell them all the time that I don't? I say no, but they just say, yes, I do. They swear it's my fault and that I'm making them do this to me. Am I making them do it? I'd curl up into a ball on the floor under the bed and rack my brains. I'd spend hours trying to figure out how I made them do it so I could just make them stop. One morning, I was hiding in one of the tiny back bedrooms when Shiny Head came in with a dark-haired face, sat me up in the bed, and took off my clothes. Shiny Head then grabbed hold of my head and put his pee thing in my mouth. He pushed it in and out of my mouth so hard that I started to gag. He stopped after a while and put my hand around his pee thing. Next, he put his hand around mine, squeezing it really hard and jiggling it up and down. The dark-haired face then grabbed my head and some of my hair and started to try to put his pee thing in my mouth. I started to cry and squeezed my lips together tight. This made him pinch my face until I cried out loud. He demanded that I open my mouth properly. Shiny Head said it would be over quicker if I just did as I was told. So I opened my mouth, and the dark-haired face pushed his pee thing into it. He pushed it so hard and so suddenly that I threw up a bit and couldn't stop crying no matter how much I tried. He was hurting me, but he didn't stop till he squirted hot liquid all over me. It tasted horrible, and I started vomiting in earnest. As I was bent over choking and retching, Shiny Head was grumbling at me for spoiling it, but was still jiggling my hand. Then he squirted his hot liquid all over the back of my head and shoulders as I was throwing up. When it was over, I grabbed my clothes, rushed downstairs to the toilet, and carried on retching and throwing up nothing for ages. My mouth felt dirty, and I washed it out over and over. My neck and face were throbbing, and my jaw was visibly bruised. I sank down onto the floor. No tears came this time. I was too shocked to cry, as I literally sat there for hours. I had a bruise on my face, and my lip was split. And later, when I winced at the salty food Roma had just given us, she just shrugged and said, "Not to worry, it'll be a pig's foot in the morning." Karen awaited the morning with dread and nausea. The abuse was far from over, as Shy tells it. Over the following months, things went from bad to worse. The faces came to me more often, making me do more and more terrible things. Every time they lay on top of me and make me do the horrible, it made me sore all over again. Afterwards, pee and poo would just come out of me whenever it wanted to. When I was walking, getting up, or bending, and it would make me feel bad because I was being dirty, just like the faces told me I was. Sometimes after the horrible, blood would come out as well as pee and poo, which frightened me and made me cry even more, but Shiny Head would get angry and say, "Fucking dirty tart, it's your own fault for moving about too much and not helping when I'm in the fucking mood. Just shut up and get on with it. If you just kept still and listened to what you're being told, then things wouldn't get like that, would they? What have you got to make a fuss for? Making everyone do it the fucking hard way. You bring it all on yourself, don't you?" One time I remember crying and resisting because I didn't want to put Hairy Face's pee thing in my mouth. It smelt bad, tasted bad, and had rough bits of skin stuck on it. It was making me gag, and I was trying not to do it, but Shiny Head took hold of my head and made me do it properly. My mouth and neck were sore for ages after, from where he'd squeezed me. But as Shiny Head said, it was me making this happen. I was making this happen to me so much that I can't remember a time when I wasn't sore in my pee and poo places, or a time when my body didn't hurt somewhere. I was getting really frightened because small, rough tags of skin were now growing on my hands and in my mouth. Once, When Roma caught me inspecting the inside of my mouth in the mirror, she told me, "They're baby pig's feet waiting to grow up." I completely freaked out and spent weeks trying to rub those things off me. Shai witnessed similar abuse happen to the other girls. She caught Stanley's dark-haired friend raping Roma. Stanley appeared behind Karen as she watched in horror. She noted that he was more titillated than horrified by the fact that his friend was defiling his daughter. Stanley then forced Karen to give him a hand job. Karen ran to the bathroom immediately afterwards and scrubbed her hands and mouth raw for hours. The horror that occurred in this household wasn't always rooted in sexual abuse. As Shai recalled, the tap we all used only gave cold water at first. Then it got hotter and hotter until it was unbearable. So I asked Roma for some cooler water to rinse out my mouth. She didn't know why I wanted to rinse out my mouth. She picked up the kettle and poured what she thought was cold water into my mouth. I screamed in agony as the skin peeled off my chin, neck, and arm. Roma was mortified and screamed in terrified horror. My howls of pain brought Shiny Head and Jennifer rushing to the kitchen. "What the fuck's going on?" he roared. I was on the floor in shocked pain, and Roma was screaming that she thought the water was cold. The fact was, the kettle always sat there with cold water in it, and we all often drank from it. Roma really didn't do it on purpose, but Jennifer beat her as though she had. She grabbed Roma's hair and pulled it out in bleeding clumps. I tried to tell Mum, but I couldn't speak. I never got the feeling that Mum or Shiny Head did any of this to protect me. They seemed more angry that we were taking up their time. Karen was taken to the hospital, a rare occurrence, while she was growing up. While Karen was healing from the cuts and burns, Stanley and his accomplices continued to rape her throughout the process, piling trauma on top of trauma. A traumatic upbringing can lead to internal physical distress, which can manifest as things like irritable bowel syndrome and chronic bedwetting. Karen began wetting the bed regularly, and she was punished by being put in a tin bathtub. Whether the water was scaldingly hot or icy cold, some of her skin would be torn off on the sides. Stanley would soap up his hands and violate her clean, scrubbing her all over, including an invasive vaginal and anal digging. He would sometimes play it off like it was an accident, but eventually he would whip out his penis and make her suck it or jerk him off. And that was, of course, entirely intentional. And naturally, it didn't help to complain because he could and would make it worse. Subsequently, her sister was dragged into it, and this Karen could not abide. To quote Shai, "One night I was in the tub with my sister behind me, and I was facing the other way. Shiny Head was washing out my poo place with his fingers when I heard my sister crying. I wriggled away from his fingers and turned round to see him trying to make her suck his pee thing. I was horrified. I remember thinking, please get off her. You're hurting her. How can I stop him? What do I do? Please don't make her cry. Please stop it. She doesn't want to." I stepped towards Shiny Head, moved her away, and started jiggling his pee thing and putting it in my mouth, all by myself. She fled upstairs. I stayed for a long time, making everything sore. When Shiny Head was finished, he smiled at me. It was the first time he had ever seemed really pleased with me after the horrible. He said I did good, and that if I did it as nice as that again, I could have a new dolly that was as big as me. I didn't really want a dolly. I just wanted to see my sister, so I thanked him and ran upstairs to find her. Karen and Denise still could not find comfort and empathy in their mother. As Shai recounted, "We always wanted Mum, but Mum wasn't around. We never questioned why or did more than wonder where she was. Even when she was home, she didn't speak to me anyway. Most of the time she would say she didn't hear me or couldn't understand me. Mum didn't like me to talk to her or touch her. When I tried to talk to her, she couldn't really hear me. I remember trying to climb up onto her lap for a hug, but she'd always push me away. 'I'm not the hugging kind,' she'd say, as she moved me away. One time when she said this to me, I remember thinking, but she hugs everyone else, and she can hear them when they talk to her. I decided to see if talking really loud to her would work any better. She suddenly got very angry with me and hit me on the side of the head with her shoe until blood started to trickle from my ear down my neck. When she saw I was bleeding, she got scared and told me in an urgent voice, 'You must have banged your ear when you fell down just then.' I looked up at her, not understanding. She said even more frantically, 'It was an accident, wasn't it?' I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't want to make her angrier, so I agreed, and she calmed down. Karen was taken to a doctor for a second time. He had many questions for Jennifer. He wanted to know why Karen rocked back and forth compulsively. He wanted to know why she spoke in a monotone voice. He wanted to know why she wasn't in school. He wanted to know why she had never been to school. He wanted to know why she had a bruise on her ear. Normalcy was integrated into the lives of the three girls. They were eating more. They acquired more clothing. They weren't beaten as much, since the telltale signs, like bruises and scars, would likely attract the attention of social workers and other mandated reporters. School was a much-needed haven for Karen. She wasn't beaten and raped by the adults at school. Despite all that, she was frequently sent home because she was always wetting herself. Life in the Claridge house was chaotic. There was no set routine except when the girls went to school. The only thing that Karen could count on was what she referred to as the horrible. If one of them targeted her sister, she would move Denise out of the way and take the hit for her. She couldn't bear to hear her cry. Stanley had relatives that took a liking to Karen and her sister. They treated her well, and she enjoyed having them over. Aside from Roma, Karen and Denise were the closest they had to grandchildren. Her step-aunt, Donna, even proposed the idea of Karen spending a weekend with them at their house. Stanley didn't like this idea. It's pure speculation, but perhaps he was nervous Karen would report all the abuse and neglect she suffered under his roof. The night Donna and her husband Ken offered to take Karen for the weekend, Stanley came into Karen's room to be serviced. Karen made a pitch for his consent to let her go to Donna and Ken's place. To quote Shai, "That night, when I was in my bed and Stanley came in for his jiggle, I was still fantasizing about how wonderful it would be to spend a whole weekend with Aunt Pat, Uncle Ken, and Donna. Stanley lifted the sheets, and I felt the mattress sink down. I didn't want to jiggle and kept resisting. Eventually, Stanley whispered gruffly, 'What's up with you?' I crossed my fingers for good luck and asked him, 'Can I go and stay with Aunt Pat?' Stanley said, 'What do you want to go there for?' 'Because I love them. I could see in the half-light of the bedroom that Stanley looked a bit worried. Then he explained, "They don't love you. I love you, and I love you the way you want me to." I didn't understand what he meant, so I asked him, "Remember that time when you sucked me in the tin bath all by yourself?" I nodded, hoping he could see me in the dim light. He said, "Well, I never asked you to do that, did I? You wanted to do it, so you chose the way all by yourself." Then his voice got very low and serious as he added, "What you do to me is between you and me. What you do with the others is none of my business, is it? I won't tell if you won't. I'm only doing what you like, and if you tell other people, they won't understand you like I do. They will call you a dirty girl and lock you away. Do you want that? Do you want them to call you a dirty girl? Do you want them to take you away for being dirty?" The thought terrified me. I had visions of prison cells and being far away from my sister. I shook my head firmly and said no. Then his voice got a bit nicer as he said, "What we do is our secret. I'll help make sure that no one ever finds out what you're really like, and make sure no one takes you away for it. I'm your dad. I'll protect you. And I'll think about Pat and Ken." One day, Karen decided to tell her mother about what Stanley was doing to her in hopes that she would intervene on her behalf. As Shai tells it, "I stood by her bed, and even though I was really scared, I blurted out, 'I have a secret.' This made her turn towards me. She said slowly, 'What do you mean?' I took a deep breath and repeated, 'Mom, I have a secret.' She looked at me funnily, with her head sort of on one side, and her eyes went a bit narrow. Then she said, 'What secret?' I said I wasn't allowed to say. She said I had to tell her. I suck Dad's pee thing and jiggle it." Her face changed. She looked straight at me and said in a quiet, low voice I had never heard before, "Say that again." I started to cry because I was saying the words out loud, but she just couldn't seem to hear me. She looked angrier than I had ever seen her before. She pushed back the bed covers and sat on the edge of the bed. I was getting very frightened, so I closed my eyes and waited for the bright lights and pain to start. With my eyes closed, I stood and waited, but nothing happened. No lights, no pain, just silence. Then I felt her shake me, and she said, loudly now, "Say it again." I opened my eyes and said, "He makes me jiggle and suck his pee thing." What does jiggle mean? I didn't have the words, so I moved my hand to show her, and she just went mad. She flew off the bed, grabbed me, and we were downstairs in a moment. She screamed for Roma, who ran in from outside. Mom told her to stay there with me, in the back living room, then ran out of the house. Roma started saying, "What have you done? What have you said? Why is your mother angry at me?" I began to cry. "Shut up," said Roma. "Just tell me what you told her." For some reason, and without ever understanding why, I stopped crying and started laughing. Roma hit the roof. All I could think was, how can I shut up and tell you something at the same time? Roma looked scared, though, so I stopped laughing and tried to listen to what she was saying. But she was shouting so fast that I couldn't make out the words. Eventually, Mum came roaring back into the house. Mum made us all stand in a row in front of the living room fire. We were facing her, and she paced up and down in front of us. "What's been going on?" Mum said, looking at each of us in turn. We were trying not to cry, but we were getting more scared. We looked at each other, and we knew what she meant, but we didn't know all the words, and we were just too scared to say anything anyway. Denise sat down on the floor, sobbing, and I knelt down to help her. Suddenly, Stanley stormed into the room. Denise went quiet, and I stood up to get ready for the pain and bright lights. He was wild-eyed, and his face was all white and angry-looking. "Why the hell have I been called home from work in the middle of the fucking day?" he snarled. Nobody answered. Denise stood up again. We didn't know where to look. Everyone seemed so cross. Then Mum said to Stanley, "Our Karen says you've been making them jiggle and suck your pee thing." Then she made a motion with her hand. Stanley roared, "What the fuck is going on here? What's fucking being said? I'm hardly ever here, so how can I do anything? She's a lying, dirty bitch. How can I do anything like that if I'm hardly ever here?" I thought, I'm not talking about when you're not here. I'm talking about when you are. He kept going on, and they screamed at one another for ages. As we stood there, looking at the ground and sneaking glances at each other, Mum screamed, "Why would she say such a thing?" Stanley said, "I don't fucking know. She's your lying mongrel, not mine." I felt Denise standing next to me shaking, and we had both already wet ourselves. Stanley glared at them, then suddenly shouted, "Fucking ask them then." Mum turned to us and said, "Well, is it true? Is he making you do those things?" I looked at Roma and Denise and waited for someone to tell Mum all about the horrible. I thought that everything would change and Mum would make him stop. But they wouldn't meet my eye. They were frightened and visibly shaking from head to toe. Mum repeated, much more loudly now, "Tell me now. Is he making you do what Karen said?" They looked at each other and cried, "No." "So nothing is happening?" Mum asked, her voice becoming shrill. Faces turned toward the floor. They stammered that they didn't know what I was talking about. I felt like a vice was gripping my chest. I was so shocked that I couldn't make a sound. Nobody had hit me, but it felt like a big, hard kick in my chest. How could they say that nothing was happening? Stanley was pacing around now, triumphantly screaming, "See, I told you so. It's her, the dirty, lying bitch. Someone's been teaching her bad habits, but it's not fucking me. I try and stop her if she starts on me. I've got you. Why would I want to do anything like that for?" I couldn't believe this was happening. I felt like I was going to be sick. I knew Roma didn't know what was happening to us, as she was never there, and I had never seen Shinyhead do the horrible to her, so I kind of understood why she had said no. But, even so, knowing everything we knew, I was devastated that Denise had not backed me up. Then, suddenly, the bright lights came, as Mum kicked me across the living room. She screamed at Stanley to take the others upstairs. They all ran out of the room. Mum rounded in on me, her arms and feet flailing. "You're fucking me up. You're nothing but a dirty, lying bitch. How dare you try to steal Stan away from me, you dirty bitch. You needed to be taught a lesson." She stripped my clothes off me and dragged me sobbing across the living room floor and into the kitchen. Tears streamed down my face as she yanked me by the arm across the carpet, burning my legs. "I'm not lying, Mum. I'm not lying," I screamed. Mom spun around and shouted, "I'm going to wash that filthy mouth of yours out." She grabbed me by the neck, pried my lips apart, and poured the stuff that Roma used to wash the toilet down my throat. It stung and burnt my lips. My tongue felt swollen and too large for my mouth. I screamed and pleaded with her to stop. She said I was a dirty girl and I needed to be cleaned. Then she washed my mouth out and my pee and poo places. When she'd finished, I lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. Everything felt burnt and red raw. Mom was still screaming at me. "If you ever speak a word to me again, it will be your fucking last." Then she grabbed my hair and thrust her face into mine. "You must never, ever talk about any of this to anyone ever again. Do you hear me?" Still lying on the floor, I whimpered, "Okay, please stop now. I won't tell." "You're still talking. I told you not to talk," she screamed. Whack! She hit me hard across the cheek. "Stop, please, Mom, stop," I cried out in pain. Clutching my swollen face, whack! I yelped, unable to stop myself from crying out. Mom hit me until I fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I was asleep. It could have been hours or days. But when I woke up, everything had changed again. Roma and Denise had gone to stay with relatives. Mom was nowhere to be seen, and I was all alone with Stanley. That night, when I went to bed, I heard the door creak open. A shaft of light fell across the floor. Stanley whispered, "Are you awake?" I didn't answer. It didn't matter if I was or not. Karen was left to heal in silence and isolation. She didn't go to school. Nobody helped mend her injuries. She was no longer allowed to speak to her sister. Stanley now had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to Karen, and nobody would do anything about it. The only silver linings were that she didn't see Stanley's friends for a time, and she didn't have to eat Roma's food. Her mother wouldn't speak to her. She would only communicate with Karen through an intermediary. Her mother was seldom at home anyway. She was usually out stealing, shopping, playing bingo, and making the rounds with local men as the town pump. The only time she took her daughters out with her was when she would enlist them as accomplices in shoplifting. She would hide stolen items in their clothing. Her mother would put her in a baby carriage at the age of 5 because she could steal more merchandise that way. One day, Karen's father showed up in the neighborhood. They had a loving reunion. He asked her where she was living with her mother. When he went to Stanley's house, Jennifer beat him until he was bleeding. She bragged about it to Stanley afterwards. He said that he would kill Frederick if he ever darkened his door again. On another occasion, when Karen and Frederick reunited, he explained why he gave her the nickname Shy. He said it was because in every photograph she posed for, she tilted her head off to the side bashfully. She had to sneak around to visit with her father because she was afraid that Stanley would literally kill him. Frederick was still in love with Jennifer and missed her to the point that he would break down in tears. Once when Stanley caught Frederick with Karen in his car, Stanley beat him up and sent Karen back to the house. Karen wasn't beaten that night. Stanley came in only to get a hand job. Karen learned some hard lessons about the deviant moral code of the House of Claridge. I had learned that when we shopped with Mum, it was called shopping. But if we shopped on our own, that was called stealing. Smack. I learned that when I got beaten, that was called a punishment. But if I hit back, that was called naughty. Smack. Smack. I learned that when Mum and Stanley told lies, that was called the truth. But if I told a lie, that was bad. Smack, smack, smack. Unless they said I could lie, in which case it wasn't a lie. It was a secret, which, if you tell, you will get smacked. Learning by smack was hard and confusing, but it was the least of our worries. Karen hoped and anticipated that Frederick would show up and liberate her and Denise from the horrors of life in Stanley's house. The light at the end of that long dark tunnel closed like an iris. As she explained, "One memory of this time stands out above all the others. Indeed, it will stay with me for the rest of my life. Stanley had kept me home from school yet again. He was in the sitting room with me, pestering me to do the horrible. I've got tummy ache," I lied, clutching my stomach. "Stop fucking me about when I'm in the mood. It's your tummy ache, not mine. Anyway, I won't be long." I shouted no, and managed to squirm free of his hands as they pawed at me. Stanley's patience snapped, and I saw a sudden flash of real anger. He grabbed me roughly and pinned my arms down to the sofa, his face looming above me. I could smell his breath. It was bitter and rancid. When he spoke, I could see the yellow stains on his teeth. He said, "I'm your father, and you will do what I tell you to." Before I could stop myself, I had blurted out, "You're not my father. My father is taking us away from here. I've told him, you know." Stanley laughed and said he didn't give a shit about all that and hurled me off the sofa and across the room. I didn't cry even though it hurt. I stayed where I had fallen, knowing better than to try and move. I watched as Stanley came towards me. He knelt down and snarled into my face. "Your father. Your fucking father. Your father ain't taken anyone anywhere. Your father's dead." I froze, fear coursing through my body. I knew what dead meant. I knew you were buried in the ground, and everyone who loved you or missed you couldn't see or talk to you anymore. I was petrified. I screamed, "No, he's not. You're lying. You're lying." Stanley laughed again. "I'm telling you, you stupid cow, he's dead." Then I did something I'd never done before. I launched myself at Stanley and started punching his face. I was screaming, "No, no, no!" Stanley seemed startled at first, but then smacked me back and told me to calm down, but I just couldn't. He finally slapped me hard enough to stop me hitting him. Stanley said, "Look, Karen, he never fucking loved you anyway. He was nothing but trouble. He's dead now, but you've still got me and your mom, so just calm yourself down." Fear had given me courage. I looked Stanley in the eye and said, in a cold, low voice that didn't sound like mine, "You killed him at the train station." He said, "No, I fucking never. He died in a car accident. He killed his fucking self." I didn't know what to think. I just wanted Stanley to stop saying my father was dead. I said, "I want Aunt Pat." I knew that she'd tell me the truth. "Her and Ken have gone abroad with the army, so you can forget about all that nonsense." "Abroad?" I repeated dumbly. I felt overwhelmed. I'd lost everyone who could help me, and there was no one else to turn to now. I just sat there and whimpered over and over, "My father's not dead." Tears were streaming down my cheeks, but I wasn't making a crying sound. Stanley shrugged and said, "I've told you before, he's no fucking good, and you're better off without him, and you're not to talk to your mom about him, ever, unless you want the belt. Got it?" I just nodded. I had nothing more to say about anything or anyone. I had no more words and no more sounds to make. I just wanted the world to stop. Mum suddenly came into the room. I looked straight at her, but she wouldn't look at me. She never did. Then they started arguing. She didn't seem upset that my father was dead, just angry at me for knowing about it. I stayed sitting on the floor in silence. Mom asked Stanley, "Have you told her he died in a car accident in London?" He said he had. Mom glanced in my direction. "Why is she just sitting there rocking?" She hit me when I told her about it, so I had to calm her down with a little smack. Mom replied, "Well, remember to mind her head." She paused, then she said, "It's not normal, this rocking. She's doing my head in. Tell her to stop it or go to her room." Stanley said, "Yeah, she should be crying, but you know what she's like. Just ignore her." I could barely hear them anymore. I was locked in my own thoughts. Despair rushed in on me as I realized I was completely and utterly alone. My father had gone, Aunt Pat and Uncle Ken had gone, and my sister was drifting further and further away from me. I had never felt a loneliness quite so profound as this. After a while, I went upstairs to my room and sat on my bed, rocking silently and replaying everything that had just gone on. I kept turning over in my head the words that he had said, that I should be crying. I realized then that he wanted me to cry. It was almost as if he liked seeing me upset. This realization stirred something new in me. For the first time, I felt defiance rise inside me, an anger that I'd never experienced. And in that moment, I made myself a promise. I would never cry for Stanley ever again. 1969. Just months before the Manson family murdered all those people in cold blood, Jennifer and Stanley announced to the kids that they were getting married, and Stanley would adopt the girls. Rather ominously, Stanley declared to Karen the day of the wedding, "I'm your real daddy now." He followed up by raping her. Jennifer favored Denise, dolling her up and parading her around as if she had won a child beauty pageant. If Denise was caught playing with Karen, she would be admonished for it. Karen was ignored and abused by Jennifer. Karen experienced poor eyesight for years due to all the blows that rained down on her head by Jennifer and Stanley. She also experienced some hearing loss. The eyesight cleared up eventually. Other children at school thought she was stuck up because she didn't address what they were saying to her. After a while, she was marginalized. Karen believed what Stanley told her about how she was dirty. She was afraid that if she told outsiders about the abuse, they too would believe she was a dirty person, so she kept it to herself. Karen recalled how her home was no haven. Home was a dark, painful, lonely place. I was missing my father and wanted to see him, to say sorry for killing him, but I wasn't allowed to talk about him. That was okay, though, because I was getting really good at not talking about all kinds of things. She especially didn't allow herself to cry. She didn't want to give Stanley the satisfaction. Even at the age of 6, she could tell he was a sadist. Karen kept her promise to herself to never cry whenever Stanley inflicted his tortures upon her. In fact, she retreated into her shell almost entirely. She became belligerent and recalcitrant towards him. He went ballistic, beating her black and blue, and screaming at her to call him father, or its colloquial equivalent. She called him Shiny Head once, accidentally. It was a slip, but free of regret. At one point, Jennifer was called to Karen's school to be asked about why Karen was so frequently absent. She certainly wasn't going to tell school officials that Karen was being kept home from school so her stepfather could beat and rape her. An investigation must have been in the works, for Jennifer announced to Karen that they were going to move. They moved to Merseyside, and their new address was close to that of Karen's Aunt Pat, a development Karen was very excited about. She was 8 years old. The abuse happened at the same frequency, though there weren't as many offenders at this point. It was primarily Stanley and occasionally a man named Reg. Jennifer still took Karen with her when she shoplifted. Karen had become a highly skilled thief, and it was the only way she could win her mother's approval. Her mother didn't express the approval in a verbal or tactile way. She merely just kept taking her along, kind of like how your boss expresses appreciation for your work by not firing you. Jennifer moved the girls to another apartment, one that was in poor condition, a cold water flat with an outhouse for a restroom. It smelled foul, and its appearance was just as off-putting. Karen began to weaponize silence because she knew the adults hated it, especially Stanley. To quote Karen, silence had become a defense mechanism. Stanley could beat me black and blue, and he could do any horrible thing to me, and I could just lay or stay there, still and quiet, till he was done. Sometimes he used to hit me extra just to see if he could make me cry, and sometimes I nearly did. It drove him up the wall when he couldn't get me to, but crying was the one thing I could control, that he could not. So, no matter what he did, I would save the tears for later when I was on my own. Stanley figured out that one way to manipulate Karen was to threaten to abuse Denise, as Shai recounted. I was the main focus of Stanley's horrible attention at this point in time. He would ask me to come over to him, and I'd have to do as he said. If I refused, he would look at me with his cold blue eyes and say, "Where's our Denise then, Karen?" Even writing those words sends a shiver through me. He knew exactly how to get me to do what he wanted. Looking after my little sister was more important to me than anything, and he knew this about me and took full advantage of it. I was aware he was manipulating me at these times, but I felt powerless, so I would just take a big breath and go to him every time. We knew, without ever saying the words out loud to each other, that we hated the horrible. We didn't like it, and we wished it wasn't happening, but we had no idea how to make it stop. Still, he found other ways to strong-arm her into submitting to his abuse, as Shai noted. As I grew older, Stanley's twisted mind managed to find even more inventive ways to get me to do the horrible. I had to do it to get anything I wanted or needed in life. To eat, go to school, get dressed, breathe in and out. Everything any normal child took for granted was used against me as a means to manipulate me into doing the horrible. He used it like a currency. Do the horrible and you can play with your sister. Do the horrible and you can sleep. What was more, the punishment for not doing it when he was in the mood had always been a beating. But unfortunately, Stanley said this wasn't working on me anymore, so I had to do more horrible instead. The horrible was now both carrot and stick, a punishment as well as a currency. It pervaded every aspect of my life, everything I did or didn't do. Karen's health began to improve as she was beaten about the head less often. Her senses improved. To quote Shai, "My vision was now 20/20. My hearing and speech had vastly improved. But the more I could see and hear, the less I wanted to. The more I could understand, the more I longed for the days when I wasn't really aware of what was happening to me or around me. The more I could speak properly, the less I wanted to say. I felt like I was disappearing inside myself. They moved yet again when a new house became available on the other side of town. It was a council house with 3 bedrooms. It was a family house, and they could only move in with 3 children, so Roma was pulled out of boarding school. Karen was dreading this. She didn't want to move so far away from Pat, Ken, and Donna. Their home had been her only solace. Now there would be no place where she could find relief from a daily life that offered little more than torture and neglect. It occurred to Karen that her mother didn't know about the sexual abuse. Stanley never referred to it in Jennifer's presence, and he never initiated it when she was home. Once she was out of the house, he would say something to the effect of, "I'm in the mood." He did do it while she was home, but it generated so little noise that it never attracted her attention. Considering this, Karen came up with the idea of making noise during the act. This she did, but instead of alerting her mother to what was going on, all it accomplished was that it misled Stanley into believing that Karen was aroused by the activity. This excited him, and subsequent to that incident, he expected more of that kind of reaction, and the incidents of sexual abuse were prolonged beyond their previous parameters. They also happened more often. It led to him blaming her more than ever for allegedly tempting him because he deluded himself into thinking she had orgasms. Stanley got hired to drive a lorry or a delivery truck. Karen seldom went to school after that because he was often taking her with him in the truck. Of course, she was not serving a professional apprenticeship. He would usually sexually abuse her in the lorry. He raped her nearly every day. He would even drop her off at friends' houses. Some of them would go as far as to take still photos or videos of her, wherein she would be raped by them, and it would be visually documented. She withdrew into herself more and more as time went on. Stanley got a thrill out of watching other men rape Karen. As noted by Shy, Stanley got a sadistic pleasure out of me doing the horrible with someone else, because it seemed to prove to him that I was the dirty one, which was always his argument to make me do it when I didn't want to, which was always. Stanley told me that I was a dirty girl, and that he was stopping me from being caught for being naughty, dirty, bad. He said he was protecting me because he didn't want social services to put me in care. As a 9-year-old, I just accepted this. I hated this new stuff called Vaseline, which Stanley secretly called wet, as in, put some wet on it. I hated being woken from my sleep with him already hurting my pee and poo places, even with the wet. I hated bath time, bedtime, getting up time, daytime, all the time, really. I hated the night visits the most. I would lie in bed praying that he would leave me alone, just for one night. No matter what she did to adapt and to repel Stanley's attacks, there was little to nothing she could do to stop them. As Shy put it, I was simply overwhelmed by the daily horror that my life had become. Mentally and emotionally, I was shutting down. One day, Stanley was driving Karen to the home of a particularly violent rapist friend and client. Karen protested that she didn't want to go, pointing out that he was physically abusive. She didn't get any sympathy from Stanley. He said, "Don't be such a fucking twat. There is not a mark on you. I only interfere when they really fucking hurt you, like stab you or something. You gotta remember, you don't behave, so what do you expect?" His idea of bad behavior in Karen was that she didn't tolerate abuse gladly. A well of anger had been rising in Karen for some time, and she couldn't take Stanley's bullshit any longer. She exploded with rage, screaming. "If not screaming and crying when you're fucking hurting me is not behaving, then I don't know what is. What have you got to make it hurt? Why have you got to make it hurt?" This caught Stanley off guard, and he was so shocked he nearly crashed the lorry. He pulled it over to the side of the road. It was out of character for Karen, but she was beside herself with wrath, and before she knew it, she was punching and slapping Stanley. She was not normally a violent person, but even she had her limits. After striking him, she ejected from the lorry and ran away. He tried running after her, but he was a middle-aged smoker and could not match her youthful energy. Karen ran a long distance down a country road. Just when she had reached a point of freedom, Stanley jumped out from some bushes and beat her black and blue. He claimed he was beating her to teach her a lesson, to ensure her safety or some shit. Stanley and his friends weren't the only sources of sexual abuse in Karen's life. It seemed that wherever she went, that kind of evil lurked. There was a man named Steve in the neighborhood who rewarded children with sweets if they went to the store and bought his newspapers for him. It seemed perfectly innocent at first, but one day Karen got a painful glimpse of this man's dark side. She tells the story best. "One time when I went to see Nanny Scott, Steve was standing in his doorway. As I passed, he asked me in. I stepped inside, all excited because I thought that he was going to ask me to go to the shop. Before I knew what was happening, though, Steve had grabbed me by the back of the neck and pushed me into his bedroom. His hand felt like a vice, taking my breath away, and I yelped in pain. The next thing I knew, I was naked, face down on his bed, and squeezing my eyes shut tight to block out the horror of what was happening to me. He hurt me for ages. I didn't fight, even though he was hurting me. I just lay as still as I could, praying to anyone who might be listening for it to end. No one was listening. I lay there for an eternity until he finally pushed himself off me and wheezed, "Go make us a cup of tea, will you?" I staggered to the kitchen, too stunned to speak, and my hands trembled as I poured out his tea. When I returned, he grunted, "Do you want paper money or sweets?" I remember thinking I had never had paper money. of my own before, so I agreed to take that. He smiled like we were friends again. "Now don't go telling anyone about our arrangements, will you?" I shook my head. "Promise me now?" "I won't tell anyone. I'm used to it," I said. This seemed to please him even more. He patted me on the bum with his bony hand and told me to go. I left and ran across to the toilet at Nanny Scott's flat. By this point in my life, I was so used to the horrible happening every time I met new men that I simply accepted that it was going to happen. I didn't encourage it or initiate it, but I did always expect it. I felt that I couldn't do anything to change or alter it. I might as well just accept it. It had become something I thought all men would do to me, and although I knew that it didn't happen to everyone, Donna never had to do the horrible, I believed that it would always happen to me. I still hated it, but at least with Steve, I was given sweets or paper money. I thought I was lucky, as with Stanley I didn't get anything. I would take my sweets and rush off to Lisau Beach to recover and eat my sweets. Karen got used to prostituting herself for Steve, and she didn't tell anyone about what they were engaged in at his house. One day when Karen went to Steve's house, she was horrified all over again by what she saw. As she tells it, I went in and, to my horror, saw that he was on the bed doing the horrible to someone else. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was the only one he did that to. As I edged closer, I realized that he was on top of my baby sister. I felt sick. Denise was undressed, crying, and had blood on her legs. I went mental. I knew they knew each other, but I did not even consider that he would dare to hurt my baby sister, and besides, I had already done the horrible. The realization that it was happening to my little sister sent me into a blind rage. Without a second thought, I rushed to the kitchen, picked up a big pan, and flew back to the bedroom. Then, with every single ounce of strength I could muster, I smacked him right across the head with it. He was so shocked he didn't even try to stop me as I pounded his head. A word per smack. Get, smack, off, smack, my, smack, sister, smack. I finally hit him hard enough to get him off my sister and long enough to get us out of there. On the way home, Karen and Denise decided they would tell their mother about what happened to Denise. To their surprise, their mother believed them and flew into a rage. She took them to a hospital. The girls were examined by doctors who inspected their genitalia for evidence of sexual assault. Soon police officers were questioning the girls. This last point was confusing for Karen because Stanley and Steve and their ilk led her to believe that such treatment was normal, acceptable, and, in her case, well-deserved. For the first time in Karen's life, she was told that the kind of thing that Steve did to her and Denise was called child abuse, and people went to prison for it. Karen was informed that Steve was put behind bars. Social workers took an interest in the lives of Karen and Denise and wanted to know why they were not attending classes at school. Now Stanley could no longer take her on his rape runs. Stanley coached Karen so that she wouldn't disclose the abuse. He convinced her that she, too, would be considered dirty and immoral if the sexual abuse was uncovered, so she didn't disclose the abuse during the interviews. Police told Karen that adults were not allowed to touch her sex organs or in any other sexual way. Stanley insisted he had a special right to do so because he was her adoptive father. One day a social worker visited their home. Before meeting her, it occurred to Karen that she could get Stanley and his abuse out of her life simply by telling the social worker what was going on. The social worker started with small talk, like how Karen liked school, that sort of thing. Karen could hardly abide all that when she had such important business to deal with, so she came right out with it. Stanley makes me suck his penis. Both Stanley and Mrs. Potter, the social worker, were shocked. Mrs. Potter said, "Karen, what did you just say?" Mrs. Potter turned to Stanley and said, "Stanley, is that true?" Stanley didn't voice his objection verbally, not right away, anyway. He shook his head. He sighed. He stood and looked Mrs. Potter in the eye. He said, "It's kind of true, but not the way she says it." Mrs. Potter said nothing to this as she digested the intel. Stanley continued, "She keeps pushing herself onto me, trying to force me into letting her suck me off. I've tried to stop her, but didn't always manage it. She nearly got me a couple of times." He said he would welcome her assistance in dealing with Karen's insatiable sexual appetite. Mrs. Potter couldn't have been less helpful. "Karen, is it true? Have you been trying to force yourself on your father's privates with your mouth?" Her tone changed. It was admonishing, as if she believed Stanley, and it appeared that she did. She certainly wasn't fulfilling her role as a mandated reporter. Karen said, "No, I haven't. He makes me do it." "He knows he does." Mrs. Potter said, "That's not what your father tells us." "He's not my father." Stanley said, "That's what she always says. She's just saying this to punish me. She just hates me because I'm not her real father. Her real father tried to kill her. Then he killed himself, gassed himself to death in a car a few years back." Fun fact, Frederick did neither of those things. Stanley had more psychobabble for Mrs. Potter. The only one who abused her was him, that nutter father of hers, and she's just blaming me for it because she doesn't like me. Mrs. Walbridge, she's a friend of the family, knows all about it. She's been trying to help us get Karen's sexual urges under control, but we're not sure what to do about it. It's like she's out of control. Mrs. Potter's proposal on how to handle Karen's alleged hypersexuality was to wear extra clothing and take cold baths. Karen was so stunned by the things Stanley said to Mrs. Potter that she barely felt the vicious beating he unleashed upon her that night. Karen developed a rash on her backside that was exceedingly itchy. Jennifer took her to a doctor for treatment. He diagnosed it as a symptom of a sexually transmitted disease. He included this data in her file and contacted Mrs. Potter about it, since it was clear that a child of about 9 years old could only acquire such a condition from being sexually abused by an adult. Social services decided the best way to rein in Karen's nymphomania was to send her to a boarding school for girls. Hence, she was sent to St. Mary's Convent Catholic School. Most girls would dread attending school in such a draconian religious environment. Whether or not the nuns rapped the girls on the knuckles with rulers, it was better than being raped by Stanley and his pedo posse. Karen acted out and questioned the Christian orthodoxy nonetheless, and she was soon expelled. She was driven to the home of her nanny and grandpa Walbridge. There she resided in a shed and used a bucket for a latrine. She spent her days doing chores. Nanny Walbridge was a real hard ass. Karen was not to speak unless spoken to. She was never to remove all her clothes for any reason. Karen couldn't go anywhere without permission. She couldn't do anything without permission. It was like reform school, except she was the only inmate. She was required to wash 3 times a day in the icy cold water of a stream nearby. Nanny Walbridge smacked her when she spoke without permission and when she used profanity. There was no light in the shed when Nanny Walbridge left her alone in there. Relief and kindness came from Grandpa Walbridge. He would bring her food and tea. He brought her a lamp for light and a blanket for warmth. She was also greatly relieved when he didn't rape her. She finally got to experience what it's like when a man shows you love and kindness instead of taking advantage of you and abusing you. One day, Karen enlightened Nanny Walbridge on the nature of her relationship with Stanley. "You've got to believe me, I didn't do it. He blames me for it, but it's not me. Honestly, it's not me. I don't know how to make him or any of them stop. I just want them to stop. I know I make them bad, but I don't know how." All of a sudden, Nanny had stopped smacking me. Her face had gone white. Grandpa stepped in from outside. Nanny stared at me. She still had a strange look on her face and said she begged my pardon. I didn't know what she meant, but I realized I had said too much, so I just gazed at the floor and shrugged my shoulders as she begged my pardon some more. I kept quiet, and she told me in a soft voice to go to my room and wait to be called. I nodded and left. As I walked around to my room in the tool shed and passed under the train windows, I could hear Nanny and Grandpa talking. Nanny sounded really shocked, and Grandpa was saying, "You should never have smacked her like that, Vera. She's only a young girl and clearly very disturbed. She's very young to be talking this way. I don't fully understand what's going on, but it's clear the child needs our help." Grandpa's voice was very serious as he said, "They are not words from a child's mouth, Vera." The child was terrified. "I think there's something very wrong here." Nanny said, "I've got a horrible feeling that Stanley and Jennifer haven't been entirely honest with us. We're going to have to tread very carefully. The child swears blind that she isn't doing anything wrong, that it's Stanley who's doing things to her. I just don't know what to believe." Her voice was trembling. Grandpa said, "I agree. She sounds honest, but frightened. Have you noticed how much she rocks?" Later, Grandpa knocked on the door to the shed. His countenance was grave. He said, "I know some things we need to talk about, Karen, but there is plenty of time for that. For now, let's get on with the chores." After establishing what duties Karen would have to carry out, Grandpa said, "Now, I know there are some other things you might like to talk about, but there is no rush." Karen said, "Like what?" "Well, like anything that is worrying you." "I'm worried about my sister and about when I will have to do something with you." This threw Grandpa for a loop. Once he regained his composure, he said, "Your sister is fine. As for the other thing, well, there will be none of that sort of thing in this place. Good grief, certainly not." Shai recalled the tidal wave of emotion that overtook her in that moment. On hearing this, I flung my arms round him and gave him a massive hug. I even let out a little cry. I couldn't help myself. I felt so relieved and so delighted at the same time. He hugged me back for a second and then pushed me away. He seemed awkward and blustery. He said, "Okay now, that's enough of all that. We'll talk about how you can overcome these..." He paused, looking like he was a little lost for words. Problems of yours, another time. For now, let's get started with the chores. I didn't know what he meant about my problems, but I was so happy that he had said I wouldn't have to do any horrible. After this, I would have walked across hot coals for Grandpa, as I could just sense he was my friend. He knew about things and was very wise. He even heard me cry, and he still liked me. He was never angry with me and was very fair, plus no horrible. For the first time in my life, I felt like I finally had a life to live in a safe home. One day, Karen overheard a conversation between Nanny and Grandpa. Nanny said, "What are you saying?" After a pause, Grandpa said, "From what I've seen of her and the concerns she has, I believe that she's telling the truth. It sounds like it really isn't Karen who's initiating these things. It's Stanley. You will agree that she hasn't exhibited any sexualized behavior around us? Indeed, she is almost overproper. She is by no means stupid or unteachable. She is extremely intelligent and learns faster than anyone I have ever taught. She has no more special needs than you or I, Vera. All this time, we've been led to believe that she is the delinquent one, but I rather think we've been misled." Nanny said, "Do you mean you think that all these things that are happening to her, that she doesn't want them to happen? You mean she's being forced?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." "Good grief, Percy." Percy said, "We're going to have to help her manage him, Vera. She can't be left to cope with things on her own." One day, Percy told Karen that she was an innocent victim of someone else's transgressions. He said, "It seems certain people have tried very hard to convince you that this badness you speak of is your fault, but the truth is, it's not. I know you hide yourself behind that fuss you sometimes make, but you are a very kind little girl, and I think others, less kind, see this in you and take advantage. I think you know very well the difference between right and wrong. You should have a little more faith in what you think and stop looking to others to decide your mind for you. I certainly trust you to make the right choice. I feel sorry that you don't trust yourself a little more. Do you understand?" Karen understood, but still she asked him, "How do you stop someone from making you do things that you don't want to do?" "What sort of things?" "Just things. Are these the things that give you sad thoughts?" "Yes. I hope that one day you will trust me enough to speak to me about them, but until then, you should know that nobody is allowed to make you do something you know is wrong, and that you should at least try going down to the stream." By going to the stream, he referred to a practice of washing her face as a psychological ritual to cleanse herself of the bad thoughts that were making her feel anxious and depressed. She tried it with some success. She could never bring herself to tell Percy what Stanley had done to her because she knew it would disturb him and she didn't like to see him upset. Vera became gentler and more empathetic in her dealings with Karen. She didn't hit her anymore and was not as harsh in her speech. Karen was required to spend a weekend with her family. She didn't want to go and dreaded the occasion, though she was looking forward to seeing Denise. Though no physical or sexual abuse occurred during the weekend, their household looked like a photograph out of a social work textbook. It was cluttered and filthy. Soiled laundry lay about the floors. Karen kept herself occupied by doing so much of the cleaning that was long overdue. Jennifer mostly just spoke to her when she asked her to go to a social services office. She stood to lose some of her stipend because she hadn't been able to prove to them that Karen was a special needs child since she was away at the Wallbridges house. Karen agreed to do it and to react to every question with silence and befuddlement, so that the social worker would think she was legitimately developmentally delayed. It worked, and Jennifer was approved for more money. Once that was sorted out, she didn't speak to Karen again that weekend. Mercifully, Stanley spent the entire weekend working on his car. He barely spoke to or made eye contact with Karen. She was still worried that he would abuse her. He didn't, and she was greatly relieved as she was driven back to the Wallbridges home. Karen had another visit at her mother's house scheduled. When she arrived, her mother was arguing with a social worker because Karen had not been living there full time, and Jennifer would not receive full benefits for Karen if she were not residing there and not demonstrative of special needs characteristics. Jennifer demanded full benefits, but the social worker didn't budge, and after she left, Jennifer went ballistic, launching into a full-out assault on Karen. She threw a small metal box at her face, which left a cut. Karen's lip was left bleeding, her legs were bruised, and she had a headache from all the blows to her cranium. Afterwards, Jennifer called up Nanny and Grandpa Wallbridge and sweet-talked them into letting Karen live with her full-time, sounding nothing like the psycho hose beast she was when she beat on Karen. She managed to talk them into it. Karen was more devastated by this than by the beating because she came to love living with the Wallbridges. Now it was back to hell on earth, with all the abuse and neglect she had endured for so many years. Sure enough, Karen's first night back, Stanley snuck into her room and demanded oral sex. The very thought of such a thing made her nauseous, and she resisted strenuously. He criticized her for being so well-spoken, a characteristic she developed at the Wallbridges, with their guidance. He said, "Talk proper. None of that snooty old bollocks will work with me, so get on with it. I don't give a shit what you think. I ain't got all night. If you're gonna start all this again, I'll take me fucking belt to you." She finally did what he demanded of her just to get it over with. The shroud had been shifted back into place. Her mother was the same thief and con artist she had always been. She once left the children on the steps of the social services building, claiming she couldn't take care of them. She contacted a reporter for a newspaper to publicize the fact that social services wouldn't give her more money, despite having a special needs child. Speaking of special needs, Karen was enrolled at a local special needs school, but she felt no more at home there than she did at a standard elementary school. Stanley continued to sneak into hers and Denise's room at night. When he attempted to abuse Denise, Karen would shift over and take her place to protect her little sister from what she had had to suffer through. Karen eventually found new hiding places for both her and her sister, and Stanley seldom found them there. Karen began to frustrate Stanley. When she didn't find ways to avoid the abuse, she no longer responded to the violence. He introduced the tactic of threatening to report her to social services and have her taken away. He would say something to the effect of, "If you don't get on with it, I'll call the social and tell them what a filthy little slut you are. Stanley became quite reckless in his pursuit of sexual gratification with Karen. When she was 11 years old, she was admitted to the intensive care unit to receive treatment for a sexually transmitted disease. Strangely, none of the staff were particularly concerned that such a young girl would have contracted an illness of that nature. During her stay, she had what appeared to be an especially heavy period. It turned out to be a miscarriage. In fact, she would have 2 more miscarriages by the time she turned 14. And again, not one doctor ever considered that this was unusual, irregular even. 11 years old, 12 years old, miscarriages, STDs, no alarm bells, no red flags, none. It was also in her 11th year that she woke up one night retching. Stanley stuck his penis in her mouth while she was sleeping. He was holding her head in place by the ears. He held her head so firmly it hurt. She tried to wriggle herself free, but he was too strong for her. Suddenly a figure appeared behind him. It was Jennifer. Karen was overjoyed to find that her mother caught Stanley red-handed. When he heard her, he gesticulated like he was wrestling Karen down to the bed in an effort to depict her as the aggressor. He dug his elbow into her chest to the point where she cried out in pain. He began to throw her around the room, claiming she was fighting him. Jennifer walked further into the room and said, "What's going on here?" Stanley said, "I don't know. I think she's having an epileptic fit." Jennifer ran over and joined in the effort to restrain Karen. She said to Stanley, "You hold her arms, I'll get her legs." Stanley pulled up his fly and then joined in the effort to bring Karen's so-called seizure under control. Karen soon realized that Jennifer knew what Stanley was doing to her and didn't care. As Shai put it, she must have seen what he had been doing, but she'd chosen to ignore it. It was the most crushing blow. I couldn't believe it. What kind of mother was she? What had I done to make her hate me so much? Any shred of hope I had that Mom was going to save me and protect me disintegrated in that instant. Somehow, it was clearly easier for her to pretend that she was ignorant of what he was doing. She helped Stanley to hold me down, playing along with the charade that I was having a fit. They called 999 and reported that Karen was having a seizure and needed an ambulance. She was taken to hospital. Jennifer told the doctors that she was special needs and was now an epileptic. The doctors didn't question it. No MRI, no consultation with a neurologist, no critical thinking. She was injected with a sedative and passed out. Karen woke up in another hospital, this time a psychiatric care institution. Stanley picked up Karen when it was time for her to be discharged. The doctor gave Stanley a prescription for the same sedative that knocked her out. He was delighted. When he put it in his pocket, Karen knew that the horrible was about to take on a more sinister dimension. Karen didn't attend school for the next few months. She lay in bed and drifted in and out of consciousness as Stanley helped himself to her body. It wasn't just at her house. Stanley took her to trailer parks and other men's homes. Her life was composed of vignettes of rape and being carried around like a ventriloquist dummy. One day Karen managed to run away. She heard a boy's voice behind her calling her name. When she turned around, he threw a brick at her face. Aside from being immensely painful, it knocked one of her teeth out. Stanley and Jennifer didn't take her to a dentist until months later. He insisted on knowing why they delayed the visit for so long. Jennifer screamed at him, and they never went to that dentist again. They were always indignant when some kind of official questioned the neglect to which they were subjecting Karen. Stanley's trafficking of Karen took on a whole new configuration. He would drop her off at the docks, where men took her in the ships and chained her foot to a metallic bed. They would film and photograph each other raping and molesting her. They became irate when she didn't smile. They would shout something to the effect of, "Smile! Stop hiding your face! Come on! You're famous! Pictures of you are like gold dust. Everyone wants them. You're a big product in the black market, a top seller. Come on, give us a smile." They thought this kind of talk would make her feel special, but it only made her feel more exploited and ashamed. She would stare into the lens of the cameras, hoping that someone on the other end would pick up on her distress and possess the moral scruples to take action to help her. Naturally, unless police or Scotland Yard were to discover those materials, nobody with a heart would ever expose themselves to such content. One particular incident stands out. To quote Shy, "I recall going to sleep in my own bed, drugged to the nines, then dreaming that I was somewhere else and trying to fight these men off who were raping me one after another. Then as I started to wake up, I began to realize it was true. I was in a strange room, hidden away somewhere. I don't know if it was on the ship or the caravan site. They were hurting me so much I could hardly breathe. I started to fight like I had never fought before, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a field miles from anywhere, mostly naked, covered in bruises and blood. My head aching like never before. A bit of my skull was sticking up under my skin. Everything looked blurry, and I was so cold, all I wanted to do was fall asleep. I was overwhelmed by tiredness and felt incredibly heavy and lethargic. The voice in my head said, "Get up and start walking, otherwise you're going to die." I managed to haul myself up and began to walk, though I had to practically drag myself. Eventually, a car stopped, and the kindly driver gave me a lift home. When I finally got back, the others seemed surprised to see me, as when I was left anywhere, I was usually gone for a while. Once I was left for 4 weeks and only knew that I'd been gone that long because I'd missed bonfire night. Everyone had simply assumed I'd been put into care again. Stanley reassured the driver, who was very concerned about me, that I was fine, just a bit mental and special needs. "Don't worry, we'll look after her from here," he said, putting his arm round my shoulder. The moment the driver had left, Stanley roared, "Fucking great! Now you've put him off. What's wrong with you? If you just behaved yourself, things wouldn't turn out like this, would they?" I was too dazed and shattered to respond. Besides, I'd long ago learnt that I was powerless to stop bad things happening to me. Some time later, because I was in such a state and my vision was so bad, Mom took me to hospital and told the doctors that I'd fallen off a swing. As usual, they swallowed her story and, after treating me, told her that I had a fractured skull and needed to rest at home in the dark. It took me many months to regain my sight. Even though I was trying to recover, Stanley never left me alone. The drugs had already made me vulnerable, but now I was even more so. Stanley took full advantage of my weakened defenses. I began to understand that the drugs were giving Stanley more power and making everything worse. and I just had to find a way to stop taking them. I became so desperate to stop what was happening that I started to pretend to take the tablets, squirreling them in the side of my mouth, then spitting them out when no one was looking. Slowly, my head started to clear, and I woke from my drug-fueled nightmare to the very real horror that was now my life. The sexual abuse continued and worsened in intensity and frequency. Stanley bought a flock of budgies, which became a neighborhood attraction for the local children. Naturally, there was nothing wholesome about it. He just wanted to become a victim magnet, and this tactic was very effective. One day, Karen's Aunt Pat paid a visit. Karen was so ecstatic about seeing her, she almost tripped over her own feet descending the stairs. She was happy to see her, but was also anxious to tell an outsider what Stanley was doing. She said, "Oh, Aunt Pat, please stop Stanley from giving me any more tablets. I'm not epileptic. Honestly, I'm not. I can't wake up properly. Please tell him, Aunt Pat. Tell him to stop." Pat became enraged. She shouted at Stanley and Jennifer, saying, "What in God's name do you think you're playing at, Stanley? Jennifer, I'm told she hasn't been out of bed for months. She's not going to school, and you know she's no more bloody epileptic than I am. Why are you giving her these tablets? You can't give a child these sort of tablets. I'm reporting you. What are you doing to her?" Stanley was really caught off guard and began to stutter, saying he was only following doctor's orders. He said, "Maybe you're right, though, Pat. Maybe the doctors have got it wrong. In fact, I'll tell them so at the very next case meeting at the hospital." Jennifer was also skittish. She said, "I don't know what's been happening, Pat. I've been so ill, and Stanley's been taking care of everything, as best he can. He's a good man." Pat wasn't buying it. She knew Jennifer had no credibility whatsoever. She said, "You're well enough to go to the bingo all the bloody time, so don't give me all that rubbish, Jennifer." Pat knew where the bottle of tablets was. She grabbed them and flushed them down the toilet. When she returned, she said, "That's it, Stanley. You give her no more tablets. Do you hear me?" Yes, Pat." "If I find out anyone's knocking her about or giving her any more drugs, they will have me to deal with. Do you understand?" Yes, Pat." "Why won't you give her a break?" All Stanley could do was shrug. He was so intimidated. He said, "You don't know what she's like. She's a little fucking bastard. Always getting into trouble everywhere she goes. She steals and she tells lies just to try to get me into trouble all the fucking time." Pat wasn't buying what he was selling. She screamed at him, "She is nothing like that with anyone else. We've had her stay with us, and she's as good as gold. Everyone says she is very shy, but she doesn't lie or steal from them or us. You're always picking on her. She doesn't do all the things you say, so why are you so hard on her? But she's very clever, Pat. She knows how to be good around others. There's something wrong with her head. She's a little bitch. She gives people the silent treatment, and it winds them up, and she don't do as she's told." Pat said, "No, she doesn't." Jennifer resumed her pitch as a put-upon victim beset by illness. "I've been so ill, Pat. I can't always know what she's doing, but I'm sure she's got something wrong with her head. She's special needs. You know she can't even read or write properly. She's so naughty, they can't even teach her. Just ask the school." Pat was apoplectic. "Listen to you. We've been telling you for years that she couldn't hear or see you properly. She's not thick, but you're always keeping her off school. No wonder she can't understand what they're saying to her. And she can read. Watch this. Pat turned to Karen. Karen, sweetheart, read this for me. She passed a newspaper to Karen. Karen read a portion of an article on the front page. Pat turned back to Jennifer. See? She can bloody well read. She asked Karen what the word construct means, and she said it means to build. She pointed this out as a means to prove that Karen was intelligent. In a comparably softer voice, she said to Karen, Karen, sweetheart, Uncle Ken will be here soon to say hello. Can you go and sit in the dining room and watch out for him, and let me have a chat with your mom and dad? While Karen was out of the room, Pat told Jennifer and Stanley that she was going out to a store momentarily. Jennifer and Stanley talked to each other while Pat was out. Karen eavesdropped from another room. She will never forget that exchange. Jennifer started with, I told you not to smack that little twat so much. Now look what you've done. She gets on my fucking nerves. Mine too. She makes my skin crawl. But if she's not here, they won't pay us. She don't know when to keep her fucking trap shut, that one. Why don't you just stick her back in the nut house? Because there's nothing wrong with her. Well, make something wrong with her, for fuck's sakes. We'll have to tell 'em all, we're moving again, or people are gonna start sniffing around. Fucking hell. See what she does to us all the fucking time? I fucking hate her. We should have let Fred fucking kill her. We wouldn't have all this bother, would we? No, I know. You know I can't stand her, but leave her alone for a bit. I'll come up with something. Shai reflected on how the dialogue made her feel at the time. I fell back against the wall as if someone had just punched me in the face. My own mother truly hated me and wanted me gone. Despite everything, I loved my mother, and even though I suspected she didn't love me back, I never realized just how much she despised me. Pat in the company of Ken showed up. He approached Karen and hugged her. He asked her if she was okay. She gave him her best plastic smile and said, I am now. He said, Wait there, sweetheart. Let me go talk with the others. She eavesdropped on Ken's conversation with Jennifer and Stanley. At one point, she heard Ken say, Why don't you just let me and Pat adopt her? You're always saying you will. Why don't you? Karen was so elated by this, she screamed out the word yes before she could think to contain herself. Stanley heard her loud and clear and shouted, Go away! Pat said, No, let her in. It's about her anyway. Karen went into the living room. Jennifer and Stanley were furious. Jennifer could have burned a hole through Karen's face. She was glaring at her with so much malice. Jennifer said to Karen, Pat and Ken want to know if you would like to go and live with them for good. They want to adopt you. What do you think about that? Karen didn't have to think about it. She said, I'd love it. I promise I'll be good. I wouldn't be far away. I would come back to see everyone. I would do good at school. I would do everything they told me to do. I won't talk unless I'm talked to. Jennifer cut her off. Well, it looks like she wouldn't mind. Jennifer wasn't at all concerned that she may never see her daughter, her own flesh and blood, ever again. She said, Yes, all right. If that's what everyone wants, I can't see why not. Stanley wasn't nearly as nonchalant about it. He said, It can't be today. I'll sort a few things out and do it later this week. Karen was thrilled and hugged Ken and Pat. Karen thanked Jennifer and Stanley. Jennifer said, That's all right. Now go wash your face and let us talk for a bit. That night, Stanley cornered Karen and said, "Now listen to me good. If you want to move in with Pat and Ken, you gotta promise me you'll never go telling your stories. It's our secret. Got it?" Karen agreed to these terms. He said, "Off to bed and no messing about." No messing about? That was rich. He made sure to squeeze one last session of the horrible in that night before Karen went to sleep. Karen's new life with Ken and Pat was not to be. She found out in the middle of the night why Stanley wanted to keep Karen behind for a few more days before letting her move to Pat's house. As Karen recounted, "I was violently dragged out of bed by a load of strangers. It was dark and I couldn't see who they were. Were they the men from the shipyard? Or was it the police coming to put me in prison for being naughty, dirty, bad? I kicked and fought, but then I heard Stanley and Mum telling me to stop, so I kept still as they carried me out of the house and into a waiting van. My heart was pounding in my ears. I begged them to tell me who they were. 'What are you doing?' I cried. 'Where are you taking me? What's going on?' They wouldn't answer me. When we were in the back of the van, I saw one of the strangers was a lady. I cried, 'What's happening?' The lady said, 'Because of what you did to your sister, you are going to be taken to a secure mental ward.' 'I didn't do anything,' I cried, completely bewildered. 'Ask her.' 'We don't need to ask her. Your parents have told us that you stabbed her. They also told me that you haven't been taking your medication.' And somehow I was asleep before I knew it." No one visited Karen. None of the GPs, psychiatrists, or social workers questioned what Jennifer and Stanley told them. They didn't even confirm whether or not Karen stabbed her sister, which, as far as allegations went, was fundamentally ludicrous. When Karen was returned to her mother in Stanley's home, Denise was shocked to hear that Karen was accused of stabbing her. That very day, Jennifer told Karen that Pat and Ken had decided against adopting her after hearing about the stabbing, and that they no longer loved her. She was as devastated about this news as she was to find out they weren't adopting her. Though nowadays social workers are always encouraged to believe the children under their care when it comes to allegations of abuse, the social workers who attended to Karen's affairs believed Stanley and Jennifer, seeing them as victims of a recalcitrant and sexually voracious child. On one occasion, when Karen was taken to the docks, she was gang-raped and wound up in the intensive care unit of a hospital being treated for a sexually transmitted disease yet again. The staff were concerned this time that she was only a child, concerned until her social worker arrived and told them what an insolent and depraved child she was. After that, the staff's medical treatment was perfunctory and their bedside manner devoid of respect and compassion. Karen was sometimes placed in foster homes. In 8 out of 10 such homes, she was sexually abused. Sometimes she was placed in the same kind of institutions where Jimmy Savile abused children, though she has not named him as an offender. She would bear witness as other children in these institutions were abused. One day when Karen was sent to one of the units, they called Stanley and Jennifer in for a meeting. They explained to them their conclusion about Karen's behavior. They told them it was fine. They decided that something else might be behind her transgressive behavior, something besides being the demon seed she was purported to be by them. Stanley was asked why she was so unhappy. He called Karen a tart and claimed she was an epileptic. I am an epileptic, and I can assure you that a seizure disorder makes no impact on the subject's sexual behavior and/or output. Karen suspected that Stanley was going to maneuver his way into getting another prescription for the tablets. All the rage Karen had been bottling up for months was ignited by this, and she leapt at him. She punched and scratched his face. She screamed at him, commanding him to tell the truth. She shouted, "Tell them what you really do." Jennifer said in a calm and measured voice, "Come on now, Karen." She turned to the social workers and said, "I think that's quite enough. Karen is clearly very upset, and all this is making her worse. You're distressing her. Anyone can see that." Jennifer had Karen discharged that very day, saying the staff were upsetting Karen too much. She said they were all going to move to a district called Runcorn, and she would be treated in hospital there. When they got home, Stanley beat Karen savagely, saying, "You're getting me into trouble." She just lay there and let the beating run its course. She spent the next few weeks in her bedroom. Not only did the trafficking not stop at that time, but to a limited degree, Karen took a proprietary approach. She knew where the regulars were, and if she wanted money, she would approach the clients independent of Stanley's involvement. It was a temporary pursuit, though. She realized that by selling herself to pedophiles, she would be no better than what Stanley said she was, i.e., a dirty slut. It was at that moment when she decided she would not pursue prostitution as a money-making venture on her own anymore. Karen was still in and out of institutions. If ever Denise told her she needed her help, like with Stanley, Karen wouldn't hesitate to return home to protect her, even if it meant escaping. While in residential care, Stanley would write letters to Karen that were salacious in content and lurid in description. They would go something like, "Hello, Karen, how are you? Look, Karen, when you're sucking things, it's no good using your teeth. You want to start thinking about what you're doing, like otherwise it's no good. Your sister does it proper now, so it's time you started thinking on." Karen only read the letters as a means to monitor the situation at home. That way, she could keep abreast of what was happening in Denise's life. Jennifer had a stroke, which left the left half of her body paralyzed. It left her vulnerable, weak, and helpless. Karen helped her as she recovered, in hopes that it would bond them together, and her mother might transform from the hateful, exploitative, abusive bitch she had been. Unfortunately, she reverted back to her old self once she overcame the symptoms of her stroke. Karen decided one last time to tell her mother that she was being sexually abused by Stanley. When she entered the room, Stanley was sitting by Jennifer. Karen just came right out with it. "Mom, Stanley still makes me suck his penis. And I am not the only one." By not the only one, she meant not only her sister, but many other children in the neighborhood. Stanley leapt off the couch and punched Karen. Karen was shocked when Jennifer got up and jumped on Stanley's back. She shouted, "Why can't you just leave them alone?" As Karen digested this, Stanley begged Jennifer to let him explain. Denise ran into the room. Jennifer pointed at Stanley and said to her, "Is it true? Is he making you do this?" Denise nodded yes. Jennifer attacked Stanley, punching him all the way out the front door. She slammed it in his face. Jennifer asked Denise and Karen dozens of questions as Stanley begged to be let in. He asked her to give him 5 minutes to explain himself. Jennifer said, "Fuck off. You promised to lay off them." Eventually, he wore her down, and she let him in. She sent the girls upstairs, and she had a talk with Stanley. The next morning, Karen woke to the sound of the doorbell ringing. When the door was opened, someone said, "Good morning. We are here to collect Karen. We are from social services." Karen was sent to a reformatory school for girls. Once more, Stanley convinced Jennifer that he was the victim. Jennifer died of a second stroke. The day of the funeral, a wake was held at the house. That evening, Stanley and his perverted friend Frank tag-teamed Karen in her room. Frank shoved a beer bottle into her rectum. When she didn't respond, having become so jaded after years of sexual abuse, he became resentful and shoved it into her harder. However, there was only so much she could take, and she slammed her buttocks against the wall, smashing the exposed end of the bottle into pieces. Frank still held what remained of the bottle. He got up and fled. Stanley was outraged. He screamed, "What have you got to be like that? Go sort yourself out, you mad bitch." As Karen dressed, her anus bled. She shot Stanley a look that scared him a little. He said, "What's the matter with you, then? What you looking at me like that for?" Karen said, "If you ever touch me or my sister again, I will kill you." "What you being like that for? Go sort yourself out. Put a pad on it or something. You're getting yourself in a right mess." Karen said, "That's the last time you touch us, or I will kill you. Do you understand?" Stanley said, "You're off your fucking head, you are. Why don't you fuck off back to school?" "That's the last time you touch us, or I will kill you in your sleep." Okay, just calm down. You didn't seem that upset. I thought it would be all right. Okay, I was wrong. I won't do it again. Just calm down." One day while Karen was supposed to be examined for injuries, the doctor at her school sexually assaulted her. She went to the police to report him, but he was well connected and retrieved her at the police station, where he brought her back to the residential school. A few days later, a potentially pivotal moment happened that could have changed the trajectory of her life, if only she hadn't been so jaded and disillusioned by life. In her words, "A few days later, while playing in the school swimming pool, I was approached by 3 men and a woman. They walked up to me very briskly, announced that they were from the police, and then, after a few bland questions, one of the men asked, very matter-of-factly, 'Have you been having sex with your father, Stanley Claridge?' I was completely taken aback by his approach. Why weren't they asking whether Stanley had been abusing me, not whether or not I had had sex with him? Nothing made sense to me, and their confrontational demeanor immediately put me on my guard. Experience had taught me that telling the truth didn't help. I thought, every time I open my mouth, things just get 10 times worse, so I didn't respond. The man asked me again. I stared at him for ages, then said in a flat voice, "That's for me to know and you to find out." He looked put out and said, "Look, sweetheart, we know you're upset because your mom's just died. But your father has already told us everything, and we just want to chat with you." I looked straight in his eyes and said, "I'm not your sweetheart. He's not my father. And if he's already told you, then you don't need me to tell you. Now leave me alone." They walked away. The blankness that had haunted me since Mum's death washed over me. Little did I know, after all my years of trying to make myself heard, this was the closest I'd ever been to getting Stanley stopped. One day, Karen was taken to magistrate court. It turned out that the doctor who sexually abused her, John Marshall, diverted accountability for the sexual abuse to Stanley. Marshall had read Stanley's sexually explicit letters to Karen and submitted them to police as evidence. Stanley was arrested and charged. With no warning or preparation, Karen appeared as a witness in court. A prosecutor said to her during the trial, "Stanley tells the court that he has been abusing you in a sexual way for some years now. Do you understand?" Karen nodded. "Do you agree with this?" Karen said nothing. The prosecutor continued, "Social services have been keeping a file on you since you have been in their care, and the courts have asked your social workers to write a report from this file to tell us more about you, which you are not permitted to see because of your age and sensitivity. Do you understand?" Karen nodded. The prosecutor went on to characterize Stanley's abuse of Karen as a, quote, "terrible crime," end quote. Stanley's attorney said, "Yes, it is a terrible crime, and my client, Mr. Claridge, admits it, but there were mitigating circumstances. Karen is a tease who sexually forced herself onto Mr. Claridge. He has repeatedly tried to stop her, but has been unable to. The problem, I'm afraid, is Karen. When Karen isn't at home, Stanley, despite having a bad back, is a loving, devoted father to his daughters and committed himself to caring full-time for a sick wife, whom he recently lost. Karen's sister says that she has never been abused by him and agrees that whatever is happening is Karen's fault, as do social services, whose report fully supports Mr. Claridge's statement of mitigation. As before, everybody looked at Karen as if she were the succubus of Stanley Claridge's waking hours, a she-devil tempting Stanley into depravity. Stanley was nevertheless charged with indecent assault for forcing Karen into performing oral sex on him. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation. He was sent back to live alone with Denise, while Karen went back to live in an institution supervised by John Marshall. Shy ran away to London. After spending some time homeless and fraternizing with the criminal element, she was mentored by a man who was an expert in writing bad checks. Before long, she mastered the art of forgery in her own right and elevated herself financially, getting an apartment, a car, and enjoying many luxuries with stolen money and merchandise. However, at some point, the police figured out who she was after a life of identity theft, and she was taken into custody. She was placed back into residential care, where she was abused once more. Karen escaped and went to Stanley's house to see if Denise was okay. She was told by Roma and Stanley that Denise hated her, but she decided she wanted to find out from Denise herself if this was true. Using a cue they worked out together, Karen waited for Denise to show up on the street, and she did. After Denise cried for a while, she updated Shy on what had been going on at the house since she was gone. "Kaz, it's all got worse. There are other children now, lots of them. Everyone's kids are being got at. There's kids all over the house. I've tried to stop him, but I can't, and..." Denise began to cry again. Having gotten that out of her system, she said, "He told me to tell you I hated you. He told me to say that I never wanted to hear from you again. He told us to say it was your fault, and he said that if I ever spoke to you again, I'd be killed and buried on Biddy Hill with the others." "He's making it up, Denise. He wouldn't have the guts to do it. He made me say nothing had ever happened. I never hated you, Kaz. You know that, don't you? I missed you. I thought you were dead for ages. Shai broke down what Stanley told Denise about the person Karen had supposedly become since she ran away. She explained that Stanley had been telling everyone that I was an international junkie drug mule who had just murdered a police officer in an undercover prostitution sting gone bad. He claimed I was on the FBI's most wanted list, and the whole country was looking for me. The stories were so ridiculous that I couldn't help but laugh. She told Shai that with their mother out of the picture, Stanley was not only raping her more often, but he was downright battering her. It was a lot to take in, especially when Denise told her she attempted suicide. Like Karen, Denise approached mandated reporters in hopes that they would take action on her behalf. She wasn't quite so fortunate. As Denise put it, I've told my teachers and the social worker, like you told me to, but they won't do anything about it. It's like they don't believe me, or they do, but they think it's my fault. At one point, Karen was in such a rage about the abuse that Stanley continued to inflict on Denise and the other children, she stormed into his house. After a half-naked boy left his bedroom, she beat Stanley black and blue. She said afterwards, I told you what would happen if you touched them again. Oh, I know, Kaz. Look, I'm sorry. Calm down. I can explain. I've missed your mum since she died, you know. You know what the others are like. They just won't leave me alone. And you know our Denise. She lies about everything, and she only does it with me when she wants something. Would you like some Vaseline with that bullshit? You lying, slippery piece of shit. You couldn't even let me say goodbye to Mum without turning it into another horror fest. Listen, Karen, you didn't even like her, and she fucking hated you. Who do you think got me making all those calls to social services? Go on. Well, it was her, wasn't it? She wanted shot of you, but I was getting sick of her interfering like... Look, Karen, it wasn't always me, was it? Be fair. What about the times you used to do it without me even asking? It wasn't just me. All the fellas liked you, but not your mum. You would have been sent away long ago if it weren't for me fighting to let you stay. Really, Dad? Why? He went on to tell her everything Denise had said and blamed her mother for what happened because she hated her. He said, I think she got a bit jealous of me and you. But what could I do? We had what we had together. What am I going to do? I couldn't leave your mum. She was ill, and she needed me. I loved you all equally, but she was getting on my nerves. She couldn't do anything anymore. I wasn't getting any more benefits to look after her full time, and I was having to feed her out of my money, clean her shitty arse, and carry her to the bathroom all the fucking time. And me with my back. It was doing my head in. She was a pain in the fucking arse, wasn't she, Kaz? Lying, Karen said. That's why I did it. After a pause, she said, Why? What did you do? It was kinder in the long run. She had no life. They said she would be dead in a month anyway, and she was like a fucking vegetable. So I just popped over Billy Rainbows, then came back and called the doctors. She was peaceful, she didn't feel no pain. Not only had he not convinced Karen that all this was true, but she became infuriated upon realizing that he was lying to her. She attacked him once again, screaming at him, punching and kicking him. Shai was determined to tell as many people as possible about the sexual abuse. She told parents in the neighborhood. Their idea of taking action was to forbid their children from going to Stanley's house. Other than that, they seemed to take the allegations with a grain of salt. Social workers had Karen arrested for making false allegations, and even the police, who initially took her seriously, dismissed the accusations. She admitted to the social workers that she had supported herself in London through fraudulent activity, and they suggested to the police that she be charged. After a few victims denied claims of being abused, nobody believed what Karen said about the matter. She was soon remanded to a girls' reformatory, though she eventually escaped after being sexually abused there. Karen was heading towards the bottom of a downward spiral. To quote Shy, "I ran straight to a family member's house, knocked on the door, and pleaded with them to use their bathroom. They refused to let me in. I begged, but they turned me away. They said, 'You're nothing but trouble, you, causing bother wherever you go. Go on, piss off.' The door slammed. Afterwards, I stood in the street outside, oblivious to the rain that was falling all around me. I had run out of options, used everything I had, and still got nowhere. It was growing dark, and I had nowhere to go, and no one to turn to. In desperation, I found myself on top of a 15-story block of flats, ready to put an end to it all. I just knew it was time. I stood on top of the flats and gazed at Birkenhead, which was spread out before me. No matter where I looked, I was reminded of one horrible memory or another. Parks, housing estates, docks, streets. Everywhere made me cringe and recoil. I felt the world was slowing down. The voice inside my head was saying, "When you jump, you mustn't look. It'll make it worse. Don't do it while things are slowed down, or it will seem like forever." For an instant, I thought about whether it was the right thing to do. But the voice said, "Oh yes, there's no way back from here." I knew no one would mourn my death. I was more alone now than I'd ever been, and I'd run out of fight. I was oblivious to the cold, wintry night air, or the wind that was cutting through me. And though there was still plenty of traffic making its noise, I couldn't hear a sound outside of what was going on in my own head. I had told everyone everything, and nothing had changed. Somehow, I had always believed that the victims would all come together and help each other stop Stanley and his friends, and the police would do the rest. But then, nothing was ever like I thought it would be. I think I watched too much TV. Why should I be made to stay trapped inside this hell, forced to watch these monsters destroy every single child whom fate had brought their way? Stanley had us all by the throats. There wasn't anything any of us could do individually, and we somehow couldn't do it together. There was nothing to do but jump. "Hello? Hello? Please, for God's sake, please don't move. My name is Glynn. Can we talk? Can we just talk?" A voice startled me. I thought, no, we can't fucking talk. Can't you see I'm busy? But I said nothing. I turned slightly to my left to see a young, anxious-looking policeman standing on the next ledge over to me. To me, the police were just uniformed people who would force me back to hell by car. But as I looked up at this poor, young, freezing policeman, teetering on the ledge near me, I could hear in his voice that he just wanted to help me. Unfortunately, he didn't know he was already talking to a corpse. I just hadn't been buried yet. I turned my head away from him and looked back down at Birkenhead. Through tear-blurred eyes, I suddenly became aware of all the fire trucks, ambulances, police, and reporters gathering at the foot of the flats. Oh shit! This is not what I wanted. I was disoriented and frightened by all the different lights flashing on and off. I started to take in just how far down it was from here, and how very near the edge I was. I didn't want people to watch me die. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to think. I took a big breath and sat down quickly, making everyone, particularly Glynn, gasp. Glynn was talking to me, reassuring me. I couldn't take in his words, but as I looked into his eyes and saw the desperation there, I suddenly felt very sorry for him. He looked worried and confused. Everything seemed very clear to me. I hated Karen's past life and was deeply afraid of what fate had in store for her future. I hated her present life and thought it was unbearable, so killing Karen was the only answer I could see. Right then, that voice I hear said, "You don't have to kill yourself to say goodbye to Karen." I took a moment to think about this, and in what seemed like an eternity, I made my choice. I stayed sitting down on the ledge, but, mentally, I stood up and leapt off the building with my eyes tight closed. As I did so, I said farewell to Karen forever. There was no pain, no sudden impact, just total blankness. Karen was dead, and whoever lived here now was currently out. Goodbye, Karen. Rest in peace. Shy was led away. Shortly after being taken back to the reformatory, she was charged for all the fraud-related crimes she committed. Before a court date, Shy's lawyer reviewed her social services file and said, "These people hate you. I've never seen a report like it." According to him, the outlook was incredibly grim. "I'm not so sure we're going to be able to keep you out of prison. In fact, I don't think there's a chance, not in light of this report." Though the judge was sympathetic to her at first, declaring her a very misguided 15-year-old girl, after he read the social services report, he sent her to prison to, quote, "calm down," end quote. He sentenced her to 6 months to 2 years in prison. Her heart barely skipped a beat. She was used to her life being shitty. How much worse could prison be than being raped and trafficked every day? Shy was informed while in prison that she was unlikely to be released after 6 months because even though she had become a model prisoner, there was nowhere she could be placed. That is, unless she was willing to go live with Stanley again. You heard it right, folks. Her 2 options were to stay in prison or go live with her abuser. She chose Stanley's house, but was already devising an escape plan. Her escape route came in the form of a man she met as a pen pal. He asked her to marry him when their relationship was barely beyond infancy. She accepted his proposal without thinking twice. They soon moved to Germany. Just a year into marriage, she moved back to London to live on her own. She didn't feel the freedom of starting anew. She felt like her life was over. With her position as a young woman with a fresh new start in life, she purchased a motorbike and became a courier. It was enough to sustain her financially, and she got an apartment of her own. After all she had gone through, she suffered an internal struggle as she made her way through the outside world. As Shy put it, "When you've been through as much as I had, though, starting over isn't as easy as it sounds. With no anchor, I couldn't see myself in my past, my present, or my future. I was like another person, trapped inside the shattered remains of an old human being, trying to make all the broken parts work and survive day to day. I was like a human ghost ship drifting on a wild and treacherous sea with the hull ripped away and nothing left inside of it. For so long, I had lived in a world where people had been unable to believe what Stanley really was. Even those people who said that they believed me still blamed me and accused me of being the cause. It was as though when they looked at me, they saw Stanley for what he really was and hated me for it. Some social workers had said they were sure I was going to be a monster, and so I would spend endless unhappy years waiting for that sodding monster to appear in me. When it never materialized, I hated them for putting that stupid idea inside my young head. I wasted a few more years resenting the time I had lost waiting for it, until I learned to stop doing that as well. They had found it so easy to see some imaginary monster inside me, but could not see Stanley for the monster he was. It would take me many years to come to terms with this, and a lot longer to let it go. Society hated and feared Stanley's crimes, but because they did, they discriminated against me. I wasn't just a child victim of mental, physical, and sexual abuse. I was also poor, an orphan, had been in care, was a former mental hospital patient, and an ex-convict. I didn't fit in anywhere, but I didn't feel as if I fitted into any of those social black holes either. Once an authority found out about my background and read my social services file, I was immediately in very real danger from all kinds of system abuse, exploitation, and discrimination, and so I was forced to hide my past and my identity. I didn't register for anything in case the authorities found out who I was. If I had to, I'd use false names. Essentially, I lived a law-abiding life, but in complete hiding from the authorities. She became a member of a motorcycling crew that rode through the streets of London in packs. She had some sexual encounters with men, but could not engage in romantic relationships because she was not prepared at that point in her life to mix sex with love. It was about that time that somebody sedated her without her knowledge and raped her while she was unconscious. Reflecting on this, she said, "When I heard this, heard that I had been abused all over again, it made me feel so vulnerable, so weak. The pain and consequences of this attack finally broke my spirit. Something snapped inside of me, and I started to sink into a deep depression. I had an emotional breakdown from which it would take me years to recover. I was still so young, but felt utterly world-weary and exhausted. My early 20s were nothing but a black, soulless, agonizing despair. I drifted through life, desperately trying to find ways to put a stop to the pain. It was as if I was watching myself from above, watching my body going into self-destruct while my mind wandered elsewhere. Shai became a recluse. She did manage to pay a visit to Denise. Denise, who was now 22 years old, finally reported Stanley's sexual abuse to the police, and he was arrested. Denise would move to Europe, and Stanley would move to prison. It was the last Shai heard of any of them for many years. It was around this time that Shai drew inspiration from tapes of the Oprah Winfrey Show. Oprah was a victim of child sexual abuse, and telling her story made it so Shai didn't feel so alone. Shai rose like a phoenix from the ashes, a new passion for life nascent and driving her out of her house and onto her motorbike. She had some new rules. She would be polite, but would never take shit from anyone. She would trust her instincts and do what felt right to her. She still felt like she could become the monster she was always told she could be, so she made a pact with herself to never have children. She was determined to resolve her mixed feelings about relationships. She would devote as much time as possible to the things that made her happy, like music and riding her motorbike. She would eventually decide that she would like to be a mother one day. That day came, but it resulted in a miscarriage, about which she was deeply depressed. She sought help for her mental health issues, and a charity that specialized in providing care was very helpful in that regard. Shai's passion for music extended to involvement. She sang in a band and eventually produced her own music on a computer. She was reluctant to make it publicly available because she didn't want the system to be able to keep abreast of her activity and whereabouts. It would be hard to avoid that recognition as a pop star. In her mid-30s, Shai met a man who made her feel emotionally secure, a man she married and procreated with. She signed a recording contract and began to earn a living from music. Shai called up Denise after years of no contact. Denise revealed to Shai's horror that Stanley didn't spend years in prison. He was still abusing children of both sexes. Shai paid a visit to her Aunt Pat and Uncle Ken. It turned out that they did want to adopt her, but Stanley lied to Shai when he told her they didn't want her. He and Jennifer lied to them when they told them Karen didn't want to live with them. Shai elaborated on this visit. That evening, Aunt Pat and Uncle Ken asked me to stay the night. As I lay in the safe, warm bed that should have been mine, in a home that should have been mine, with a family I should have grown up with, I cried like a baby. Of everything I had learned over recent months, this single revelation had more of an impact on me than almost anything else. Stanley had stolen my happiness in the cruelest of ways. It made me challenge things I had long believed without question. My brain was reevaluating everything I had ever known against this one particular revelation, and suddenly so many things started making sense to me. I now had very real concerns for the very little children being identified as a risk from Stanley. I had been away for years, and nothing had changed. All of a sudden, I realized that if I didn't stop Stanley, nobody else would. Indeed, nobody else could. Shai and Denise arranged a three-way phone call to Stanley's home. Denise did all the talking to him, while Shai recorded the call. Surprisingly, he admitted to sexually abusing Denise. So now they had real concrete evidence. It was crucial since the police declined to investigate cases of so-called historical abuse. Stanley admitted to abusing Karen and to passing them around. There were other conversations, and Shai edited them down to feature only the most incriminating material. She wrote and printed a transcript of the audio material, attached a cover letter to the package, and submitted it to police and social services. October 8th, 2000. Shai Keenan received a very specific set of instructions from the producers of an investigative television show called Newsnight. There was a code word for help. If she were to feel endangered, she should use that word. Don't accept any foods or beverages from him. Be friendly, smile, agree with every little thing he says. Don't interrupt him. Never, under any circumstances, physically attack or, God forbid, kill him. And press record when appropriate. Understood? Yes. Agreed? Yes. Shai had approached the police and social services in an effort to get Stanley arrested, but even with the evidence, the police proved themselves useless. Indeed, all the police did was pay a visit to his house and tell him to stay away from children. She was forced to take the law into her own hands. in order to prevent other children from being abused by Stanley. Hours since nightfall, Shy eagerly awaited the following day. She was in a hotel room located a 20-minute walk from a bungalow owned by Stanley. Shy was in her late 30s. She had waited far too long for this moment. She was going to stand up for herself for once in many years. She had support in her endeavor to stand up against the people who had abused her in childhood. Among them, yes, Stanley, that is, Stanley Sidney Claridge. Criminals are often identified with their middle names included. He wasn't a serial killer, but he was the stepfather who had manipulated and abused Shy for many years. He murdered her innocence. She died inside while he was abusing her. As Shy put it, this was the cunning, steely tower of a man who had wielded such perverted and corrupt power over so many, for so long. Unbeknownst to him, Shy was part of a surveillance team, and she would plant the bait that would spring the trap that would ensnare the Beast of Birkenhead, as he has been known. Her role would involve inserting a pack of his brand of cigarettes through the letterbox of his door. If all went according to plan, he would open the door to see who had given him the cigarettes. Upon seeing Shy, he might ingratiate himself to her and assume that their old business arrangements' eligibility hadn't expired and that all was forgiven. He would invite her in. She would ask him questions about the trafficking that occurred during her childhood, the trafficking he spearheaded, facilitated, and managed, and it would all be recorded by a hidden camera in her clothing. The footage would be broadcast on a special edition of Newsnight. The program was watched by millions of viewers. If the plan worked, Stanley Claridge would be public enemy number 1 in Britain. Though Shy was sure it would work, she was still nervous. She hadn't seen Stanley in decades, even in her hotel suite across the street, where he was ignorant of her presence. He loomed large. Some of the feelings that kicked up in her youth reemerged. He wouldn't want to traffic her again. She was too old. Even an 18-year-old would be past her prime in his purview. He involved her when she was a little girl. He did the same to her sister. He was doing it to underage girls now, and to underage boys. He had to be stopped. She was going to record interviews with Reg and others who had done the same to these girls. The police in Scotland Yard had failed to bring them to justice, so it was up to Shy and Newsnight. She was doing the right thing, but it was far from easy. To quote Shy, "I can find no words to fully explain what it is like to face up to your abuser. It is like walking into a wall of flames and knowing just how much it is going to hurt, but knowing you have no choice. I had tried everything else to get Stanley and the others stopped. This was the only way. Her children would potentially become endangered because of her actions. Pedophiles are a tightly knit bunch and very protective of one another. If they lack the remorse and empathy that would keep someone from sexually abusing a child, they wouldn't hesitate to harm or kill an informant. Shy had even planned for her family to be flown abroad in the event that their lives became threatened. She was also afraid that she would murder Stanley the moment she laid eyes on him. However, she didn't see him as being worth spending the rest of her life in prison. Shy put the cigarette packs through the letter slot. At first, there was no movement inside, and she wondered if the plan had fallen through. Just then, she saw his shadow against the curtains. He opened the door and greeted her with a friendly salutation, as if nothing amiss had ever transpired between the two. He welcomed her into his home. He put his arm around her, which made her skin crawl, but she didn't pull away. She wanted to lull him into a false sense of security. She looked upon a set of photos he had posted on his wall of his victims, multiple generations of them. Shy was stunned by how open Stanley was about his history as a sex offender. In a way, it made sense that he was such an open book about it. He had been reported for decades, but had faced few consequences for what he had done. He was given no evidence that he would ever truly face the music. Shy visited him a few times, recording him every time, and he always bragged about his abuse of the children, even going as far as describing the acts he committed and naming the victims. He talked about the police visit, where they sternly warned him to stay away from children. He found it laughable and considered it to be pathetic. Proving even further that he hadn't learned his lesson, he grabbed Shy by the crotch at one point, which was captured on video. She wanted to kill him for that, but doing so would have meant she wouldn't get to help other victims, and she also would not be present for her family. On the way home, she became so hysterical she had to pull her car over because she was crying and soon vomited from the shock of what had just happened. After the Newsnight documentary about Shy's case aired, the BBC received so many calls in response that their phone system crashed. Newsnight received its highest viewership and ratings in its history. Stanley was taken into custody to ensure his safety. Members of Shy's family called her a liar. However, most of the general public responded with words of support. The Merseyside police called to apologize for handling the case with such ineptitude years ago. Though she requested that another police force deal with the case, she agreed to make an official statement for Merseyside. Victims of Stanley Claridge, who had previously accused Shy of lying and defended Stanley, came forward to report him for abuse. Though Shy never completely got over the betrayal from years ago, she was happy they were coming forward nonetheless. The police informed Shy that they received so many complaints about Stanley and his friends' abuse of them that they assembled a multi-agency criminal investigation called Operation Phoenix. Over 40 investigative personnel were involved. Stanley and Reg were arrested. Social services cooperated with police, and Shy got to have a look at her social services file. Unsurprisingly, it described her as promiscuous, even when her age was in single digits. Stanley was depicted as a victim of sexual abuse, with Karen portrayed as the aggressor. At his trial, Stanley was found guilty of 19 charges, which included buggery, rape, and indecent assault. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Shy called Denise soon after. She reflected on the feelings this experience engendered. We were in a happy/sad place. Happy because we had won our fight for justice. Sad because so many lives had been lost or destroyed during the battle. There was no triumphant celebration, just relief that we were no longer needed to live in fear. Shy continues to advocate for victims of child abuse as the founder of a charity called Phoenix Survivors. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.